The torches along the fortress wall hissed as rain began to fall, and Lyra Voss pressed her back against the cold stone, counting her own heartbeat, because it was the only sound she trusted. Somewhere above her, a guard's boots scraped against the walkway, slow and lazy, unaware that a stranger was crouched in the shadow just beneath his feet. She had one chance. If she failed tonight, her brother would not see another sunrise, and she refused to let that happen. She had traveled 3 days without proper rest to reach the fortress of Kael Ashbourne, the Alpha King whose name alone made grown warriors lower their eyes. People said he ruled with a will colder than winter itself, that his court feared him more than they respected him, and that anyone foolish enough to cross him vanished before the next full moon. Lyra did not care about his reputation. She cared about the blade locked inside his private chamber, the one the old stories called sacred, the one rumored to carry a magic strong enough to lift any curse, including the wasting sickness eating away at her younger brother's body. The guard above her moved on, and Lyra let out the breath she had been holding. She slipped along the wall until she reached the narrow servant's door she had learned about from a trader who once worked inside these very halls. The lock was old, and her fingers, trained more for healing than for thievery, worked it open with a shaking patience. The door groaned as it swung inward, and she froze, listening. Nothing stirred. She stepped inside. The corridor was dim, lit only by a few low-burning lanterns, and the air smelled of stone and smoke. Lyra moved quickly, keeping to the edges where shadows pooled thickest. She had memorized the layout from whispered directions, praying the trader's memory had not failed him. Left at the second archway, down the narrow stairs, through the hall lined with old banners bearing the wolf crest of the Ashbourne line. Her heart pounded harder with every step, not from fear of being caught, but from the strange feeling that something ancient was watching her approach. When she reached the heavy door of the private chamber, she found it slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to seal it. She took this as a sign, a small mercy from whatever fate had guided her this far, and slipped inside without hesitation. The chamber was larger than she expected, its walls lined with old tapestries and shelves of things she did not recognize, relics collected across generations of rule. But her eyes found the blade instantly. It rested on a stand carved from pale wood, illuminated by a single shaft of moonlight, falling through a narrow window, as though the room itself had been built around this one object. The hilt was wrapped in silver thread, worn smooth by centuries of hands, and the blade beneath it seemed to hum with a faint light that had no earthly source. Lyra crossed the room, her boots silent against the stone floor, and reached out with trembling fingers. She hesitated only a moment, thinking of her brother's pale face and shallow breathing, before closing her hand around the hilt. The instant her skin touched the metal, heat surged through her arm, racing up into her chest, and she gasped, stumbling back a step. It was not pain exactly, but something far stranger, a pulse that felt almost alive, spreading through her veins like fire chasing through dry grass. For a heartbeat, she saw something behind her eyes that was not her own memory, a flash of golden eyes and a low growl, gone before she could understand it. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. Whatever magic lived in this blade, she did not have time to question it. She wrapped the weapon in the cloth she had brought and tucked it beneath her cloak, then turned to retrace her steps. She never made it back through the archway. Far across the fortress, in a chamber built into the highest tower, Kael Ashbourne woke with a sound caught in his throat, his hand flying to his chest, as though something had struck him there. His breathing came ragged, his skin slick with sweat despite the cool night air, and for a moment, he could not tell whether he was still dreaming. He had not felt anything like this in his entire life, a burning thread pulling tight somewhere behind his ribs, as though a hook had been sunk into his very soul and yanked without warning. He rose from his bed, pulling on a shirt with hands that were not quite steady, and crossed to the window. The fortress below looked the same as always, quiet and still beneath the rain, but something in the air had changed. He could feel it the way he felt an approaching storm long before the clouds arrived, a pressure building at the edges of his senses. A knock came at his door, sharp and urgent. His personal guard, Dorian, stood on the other side when Kael opened it, his expression troubled. "There has been movement in the lower halls, my lord," Dorian said. "One of the night watch reported an unfamiliar scent near the private chamber. We are searching now." Kael's jaw tightened. The private chamber held very little of value beyond old relics and family heirlooms, but one of those heirlooms was not simply valuable. It was dangerous in ways few people understood, and its disappearance would explain the strange burning sensation still pulsing beneath his skin. He did not wait for further explanation. He moved down the corridor with long, quick strides, Dorian struggling to keep pace, and when he reached the chamber and found the stand empty, the pale wood bare beneath the moonlight, something inside him went cold and sharp all at once. "The blade is gone," he said, though the words felt unnecessary. Anyone could see the truth of it. "Find whoever did this," he ordered. "Do not harm them. Bring them to me alive." Dorian hesitated at the strange instruction, given how swiftly Cale usually dealt with intruders, but he said nothing, and hurried off to organize the search. Cale remained in the chamber a moment longer, staring at the empty stand, his hand pressed against his chest where the burning thread still throbbed, faint but unmistakable, like a second heartbeat that did not belong to him. He did not yet understand what was happening. He only knew that whoever had taken the blade had also, somehow, taken a piece of him. Meanwhile, Lyra ran. She had barely made it out of the private chamber before she heard voices echoing down the corridor, low and urgent, calling to one another in a language of quick commands. She pressed herself into an alcove behind a hanging tapestry, holding her breath as two guards passed, their footsteps heavy and fast. When they had gone, she moved again, retracing the path toward the servant's door, praying it remained unguarded. It did not. A tall figure stood in the doorway when she rounded the final corner, blocking her only way out. She stopped short, her pulse roaring in her ears, and for one desperate moment, she considered turning back and finding another route. But there was no time. The guards behind her were closing in, and this new obstacle showed no sign of moving. "I do not want trouble," Lyra said, keeping her voice low and steady, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Let me pass, and no one needs to know I was here." The guard did not answer with words. He lunged instead, and Lyra twisted aside just in time, the blade beneath her cloak shifting with the movement, as though it, too, sensed the danger. She was no fighter, not truly, but years spent tending to wounded travelers in her small border village had taught her how bodies moved, where their weaknesses lay, and she used that knowledge now, driving her elbow into the guard's side hard enough to make him stagger. It bought her only a few seconds, but a few seconds was enough. She slipped past him and sprinted down the corridor, her cloak snapping behind her, the stolen blade clutched tight against her chest. Behind her, she heard the guard shouting, calling for others to cut off her escape, and dread pooled cold in her stomach as she realized how vast this fortress truly was, how easily she could become lost within its walls. She found a narrow stairwell she had not planned to use, and took it anyway, descending 2 steps at a time, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a storage hall lined with barrels and crates, and beyond it, faintly, she could see moonlight spilling through a gap where a loading door had been left open. She ran for it. The rain had grown heavier by the time she burst out into the night, soaking through her cloak within moments, but she did not slow. She crossed the training yard, keeping low, and scaled the outer wall using a section where old vines had grown thick enough to support her weight. Her hands were raw and bleeding by the time she reached the top, but she did not stop to notice the pain. She dropped down on the other side and ran into the tree line beyond the fortress, not daring to look back. For a while, she thought she had actually escaped. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs shook beneath her, until the fortress was nothing but a dark shape swallowed by rain and distance behind her. She slowed only when she reached a narrow stream, kneeling beside it to catch her breath, and checked that the blade remained safely wrapped beneath her cloak. It did. The strange humming warmth had not faded, and when her fingers brushed against the cloth covering it, she felt that same pulse again. Faint but insistent, like something alive, waiting to be acknowledged. She had no time to wonder what it meant. She needed to keep moving. Her brother was waiting, and every hour she delayed was an hour closer to losing him entirely. She pressed on through the forest, following the same path she had used to approach the fortress, trusting the landmarks she had memorized. The rain made everything harder to see, blurring the shapes of trees into uncertain shadows, but she kept her pace steady, refusing to let exhaustion slow her further. It was the howl that stopped her cold. It rose somewhere behind her, long and deep, carrying a note of command that made every instinct in her body scream danger. She had heard wolves before, ordinary ones, but this was different. This sound seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath her feet, and a moment later, it was answered by others, scattered through the trees, closing in from multiple directions. She broke into a run again, but it was useless. She heard movement crashing through the brush on either side of her, fast, far faster than anything human could manage, and within moments, shapes emerged from the darkness, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a predatory grace that made her blood run cold. She did not need anyone to tell her who led them. He stepped out from between two trees directly ahead of her, blocking her path entirely, and even in the darkness and rain, she could see the sharp intensity of his gaze fixed on her, or rather, on the shape hidden beneath her cloak. He was tall, his presence radiating an authority that pressed against her like a physical weight, and though his expression remained calm, there was something coiled and dangerous beneath it, barely restrained. "Give me what you took," he said, his voice low and even, "and it will go easier for you." Lyra's hand tightened around the wrapped blade beneath her cloak. She had come too far, risked too much, to surrender now. "I cannot do that," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "My brother is dying. I need this." Something flickered across his expression at her words, something she could not quite name, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Around her, the wolves that had flanked her path began to shift, their forms rippling and reshaping into men and women who stepped closer, cutting off every possible route of escape. "You do not understand what you are holding," he said. "That blade is not a cure for anything. It is dangerous, and now that you have touched it, it has bound itself to you." She did not understand what he meant, and she did not have time to ask, because in the next moment, the ground seemed to tilt beneath her, exhaustion and fear, finally catching up to her exhausted body. She stumbled, and before she could catch herself, strong arms closed around her, steady and sure, keeping her from falling. The moment his hands touched her, that same burning pulse she had felt in the chamber roared to life again, stronger now, spreading through her entire body, like lightning finding a path to ground. She heard him inhale sharply, felt his grip tighten instinctively, and when she looked up into his face, she saw her own shock mirrored there, raw and unguarded for just a moment, before he masked it again. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that could explain what had just happened between them, this sudden, undeniable current that neither had chosen and neither could deny. "Bring her," he said finally, his voice rougher than before, stepping back and releasing her as though her touch had burned him. "Take her to the fortress. She will answer for what she has done." The wolves closed in around her, and Lyra did not resist as they led her back the way she had come, her mind spinning with confusion, fear, and something else she could not name, something that felt disturbingly like recognition. She glanced back once, toward the man who had captured her, the Alpha King whose name had haunted every village along the border, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Whatever she had stolen that night, she understood now that it had also stolen something from her, something she did not yet have words for, and as the fortress gates rose ahead of them once more, dark and imposing against the storm-heavy sky, she braced herself for whatever punishment awaited, unaware that the true storm had only just begun. They walked her through the same corridors she had crept through only an hour earlier, though now every torch seemed to burn brighter, every shadow seemed to watch her more closely. The wolves who had shifted back into their human forms kept a respectful distance from their king, but none of them strayed far from Lyra, as though they expected her to bolt at any moment. She considered it, briefly, weighing her chances against the rain-soaked forest and the dozens of trained warriors surrounding her, and decided against it. There was nowhere left to run. Kale walked ahead of the group in silence, his shoulders rigid, his pace deliberate. Lyra studied him from behind, trying to understand the man everyone feared, but all she could see was tension, coiled through every line of his body, as though he too were fighting to keep something under control. She wondered if he felt the same strange pull she did, that burning thread that had ignited the moment his hands closed around her arms. She almost hoped she was imagining it. It would be easier that way. They reached the main hall, a vast chamber with high ceilings and stone pillars, carved with images of wolves in every stance, running, hunting, standing guard. A long table stretched down the center of the room, though no one sat at it now. Cale turned to face her at last, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "Leave us," he said to the guards. Dorian hesitated. "My lord, given the circumstances, perhaps it would be wiser." "I said leave us," Cale repeated, his voice carrying an edge that made even his most trusted guard fall silent. Dorian bowed his head and withdrew, taking the others with him, until only Cale and Lyra remained in the vast echoing hall. Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Lyra kept her chin lifted, refusing to show the fear coiling tight in her chest, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She had faced difficult situations before, had bargained with cruel landlords and desperate bandits to protect the people in her care, but nothing had prepared her for standing alone in front of a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. "Tell me your name," Cale said finally. "Lyra Voss," she answered, seeing no reason to lie, now that she had been caught. "And where do you come from, Lyra Voss, that you thought it wise to break into my fortress and steal from my private chamber?" "Thornfield," she said. "A border village. It does not have the resources or the protection your territory does, and it certainly does not have healers capable of curing what ails my brother. I heard stories of the blade, that it holds magic strong enough to lift curses no ordinary medicine can touch. I did not come here to cause trouble. I came here because I had no other choice left." Something shifted in his expression at her words, though he masked it quickly, his features settling back into that cool, controlled calm she assumed he wore like armor. He crossed the hall slowly, stopping a few paces from her, close enough that she could feel the strange warmth radiating from him, though she told herself it was simply the natural heat of his presence and nothing more. "The blade you stole is not a healing relic," he said. "It is a bonding relic, passed down through generations of my bloodline, tied to ancient magic older than either of us can fully understand. It does not cure illness. It creates connections between the one who wields it and the one it recognizes as worthy. What you felt when you touched it was not an accident." Lyra's stomach twisted. "That cannot be true. I felt nothing beyond a strange warmth, nothing that would explain." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, because she knew exactly what it would explain. The pull she had felt when his hands caught her in the forest. The way her whole body seemed to recognize something about him she could not name. She pushed the thought away, refusing to let herself believe something so impossible. Cale studied her closely, and for a moment, something almost like sympathy crossed his features. "Whatever you intended when you took the blade, the outcome remains the same. It has bound you to me, and unraveling that bond is neither simple nor safe. Attempting it carelessly could harm us both." "Then let me leave," she said, desperation creeping into her voice despite her effort to remain calm. "Let me take my chances. My brother needs me, and every moment I remain here is a moment closer to losing him entirely." "I cannot allow that," Cale said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Until we understand what has been done and how to safely reverse it, you remain here. I will send word to your village, arrange for your brother's care in the meantime, but you will not leave this fortress until I am certain doing so will not endanger either of you." Lyra wanted to argue, wanted to demand he release her immediately, but something in his tone told her the decision was final, and arguing further would accomplish nothing. She swallowed her protest, though frustration burned hot behind her eyes. "You cannot simply keep me here as a prisoner," she said instead. "You will not be treated as a prisoner," Cale replied. "You will have quarters, food, whatever you require for comfort. But you will remain within these walls until this matter is resolved." Before she could respond, the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Dorian returned, his expression grim. "My lord," he said, "forgive the interruption, but there is something you should see. The seer has arrived. She says she felt the bond form the moment it happened, and she insists on speaking with you immediately." Cale's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Lyra had met him, she saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like uncertainty. He turned back to her, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary, before addressing Dorian again. "Take her to the east wing," he said. "See that she is comfortable, and post a guard outside her door, for her protection as much as anything else." Dorian nodded and gestured for Lyra to follow him. As she turned to go, she glanced back once more toward Cale, finding him still watching her, his expression a careful mask that could not quite hide the storm churning beneath it. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them felt heavier than any words could have been, charged with questions neither was ready to answer. Lyra followed Dorian through unfamiliar corridors, her mind racing with everything Cale had told her. A bonding relic, ancient magic, a connection neither of them had chosen and neither could easily break. She thought of her brother, pale and weak in their small cottage, and fear twisted sharp in her chest at the thought of him waiting for her return, while she remained trapped within these walls, tangled in a magic she did not understand, and bound to a man whose very presence made her pulse race in ways she refused to examine too closely. Whatever waited for her in the days ahead, she understood one thing, with absolute certainty. Her life had changed the moment she reached for that blade, and there was no going back to the person she had been before. The seer's name was Marin, and she had lived within the fortress walls longer than most could remember, older than Cale's father had been, some whispered, though no one dared ask her directly. When Cale entered the small chamber where she waited, she was already seated by the fire, her clouded eyes fixed on the flames as though she could read something written within them. "You felt it too," he said, not bothering with greetings. "The whole fortress felt it, my lord," Marin replied, her voice dry as old parchment. The bond did not whisper into being quietly. It struck like lightning, and anyone with the sense to notice would have felt the air itself change. Cale sat across from her, running a hand through his hair, a rare display of frustration from a man who prided himself on control. "Then tell me how to undo it." Marin was quiet for a long moment, and that silence unsettled him more than any answer could have. Finally she turned her clouded gaze toward him, and though she could not truly see him, he felt as though she looked straight through to something hidden deep within. "The blade does not create bonds carelessly," she said. "It chooses. It has rested untouched in this fortress for 3 generations, waiting, and in all that time, no hand that reached for it ever triggered this reaction. Do you understand what that means?" "It means nothing," Cale said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It means a foolish girl stumbled into magic she does not understand, and now we must find a way to correct the mistake." Marin's expression did not change, but something in her tone sharpened. "You do not believe that, and neither do I." The blade recognized her the moment she touched it. "That is not a mistake. That is the very thing it was forged to do." Cale stood abruptly, pacing toward the narrow window that overlooked the training yard below, now empty and dark beneath the rain. "I did not ask for this. I have a kingdom to protect, alliances to maintain, decisions that require a clear mind and steady judgment. I cannot afford to be tethered to a stranger by magic I never chose." "None of us choose the bond," Marin said quietly. "That has always been its nature. It chooses for us, and we are left to decide what we will do with what it has given." He said nothing for a long while, staring out at the darkness, his thoughts a tangled storm he could not quite settle. Finally, he asked the question that had been circling his mind since the moment he woke, gasping in his bed. "Is there truly no way to break it?" "There are old rituals," Marin admitted. "Dangerous ones, requiring sacrifice and risk to both parties involved. I would not recommend attempting such a thing until we understand the full shape of what has formed between you. Severing a bond incorrectly does not simply separate 2 people, it can destroy them both." Cale's shoulders tensed at her words, and though he did not turn to face her, Marin could see the tightness in his frame, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Then what would you have me do? Simply accept this? Allow a thief who broke into my home to remain tethered to me indefinitely?" "I would have you be patient," Marin said. "Learn what the bond requires. Understand the girl before you decide her fate, or your own. Rushing toward destruction rarely leads anywhere good." He did not answer, and after a while, Marin rose slowly from her seat by the fire, her joints creaking with age, and made her way toward the door. Before leaving, she paused, glancing back at him one final time. "For what it is worth, my lord, the blade has never once been wrong before. Perhaps consider that, before you decide it has erred this time." She left him alone with his thoughts, the fire crackling softly in the otherwise silent room, and Cale remained there long into the night, wrestling with a truth he was not yet ready to accept. Meanwhile, Lyra found herself installed in a chamber far grander than anything she had ever known, with a soft bed, a private hearth, and windows overlooking gardens she could not fully see in the darkness. Dorian had left her with a guard posted outside her door, as promised, and though she understood the necessity, the sight of it still made her chest tighten with something close to despair. She sat on the edge of the bed, still damp from the rain, and allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. Her brother Finn was still back in Thornfield, growing weaker with each passing day, cared for only by their elderly neighbor who had promised to look after him, while Lyra completed her desperate mission. She had told him she would return within a week, with something that could help him. Now she did not know when she would return at all. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry. Crying would accomplish nothing. She needed to think clearly, to find some way to convince Cale to release her, to explain to him that whatever strange magic bound them together, it could not matter more than her brother's life. A soft knock came at the door before she could sink further into her worry. She rose cautiously, expecting Dorian or another guard, but instead found a young woman standing there, holding a tray of food and fresh clothing. "My name is Wren," the woman said with a small, kind smile. "I have been asked to see to your needs while you stay with us. I thought you might want something warm to eat, and dry clothes, given how the rain treated you." Lyra accepted the tray gratefully, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. I did not expect such hospitality, given the circumstances." Wren's smile faltered slightly, though she quickly recovered it. "We do not often see the king so shaken," she admitted, setting the clothing on a nearby chair. "Whatever happened between you two tonight, it has the whole fortress talking. Some say the bond is a blessing long overdue. Others fear what it might mean for the kingdom's alliances." Lyra frowned, setting the tray down without touching the food. "What alliances?" Wren hesitated, as though realizing she had said more than she should have. "That is not my place to discuss. Rest now. Tomorrow will bring enough questions of its own." She left before Lyra could press further, and Lyra sat alone with her thoughts once more, turning Wren's words over in her mind. Alliances. What could that possibly mean, and why did the thought of it settle so uneasily in her chest? She ate a little of the food, more out of necessity than appetite, and eventually allowed exhaustion to claim her, curling beneath unfamiliar blankets in a bed that felt far too soft after days of hard travel. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally did, her dreams were filled with golden eyes and a low, steady heartbeat that did not belong to her own body. She woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices outside her door, sharp and urgent, though the words remained too muffled to understand clearly. She rose quickly, pulling on the dry clothes Wren had left for her, and pressed her ear against the heavy wood. "You cannot simply keep her locked away and expect the council to accept this quietly," one voice was saying, low and controlled, though clearly tense. "Seraphine's family has already sent word. They expected an announcement by the end of this season, and now this happens." "The bond is not something I chose," Cale's voice replied, sharper than before. "I will not apologize for what fate has decided, nor will I be pressured into severing something I do not yet understand." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Seraphine. An announcement. Whatever alliance Wren had hinted at, it seemed to involve far more than simple politics, and the realization sent a fresh wave of unease curling through her stomach. She had come to this fortress seeking a cure for her brother, never imagining she would become tangled in matters of kingdoms and promised unions, forces far larger and more complicated than anything she had prepared herself to face. The voices outside faded as the speakers moved further down the corridor, leaving Lyra alone once more, with her racing thoughts. She sat back down on the edge of the bed, staring at the closed door, and wondered, not for the first time since arriving at this fortress, whether she had made a terrible mistake in reaching for that blade. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, something else stirred within her, something she could not quite name, a quiet curiosity about the man whose voice had defended her, however reluctantly, against pressures she did not yet fully understand. She thought of the warmth that had spread through her the moment his hands caught her in the forest, undeniable and impossible to dismiss as mere imagination. Whatever this bond truly meant, she understood now that it would not simply fade away because either of them wished it to. It had rooted itself into her, as surely as it had rooted itself into him, and the days ahead would demand answers neither of them was fully prepared to face. She did not sleep again that night, her mind too full of questions, her heart too unsettled by the strange new thread now woven through it, connecting her to a man she barely knew but somehow already could not stop thinking about. When morning finally came, pale light spilling through the tall windows of her chamber, Lyra rose feeling no more rested than when she had first lain down. She washed her face in the basin left for her, dressed in the simple clothing Wren had provided, and sat by the window watching the gardens below slowly reveal themselves in the growing daylight. Rows of silver-leafed plants stretched toward a stone fountain at the center, and beyond that, the training yard, where she had glimpsed warriors sparring the previous evening, now stood quiet and empty. A knock sounded at her door, and this time it was Dorian who entered, his expression carefully neutral, though Lyra sensed a wariness in the way he held himself around her, as though uncertain how to treat someone who had somehow become bound to his king through ancient magic. "The king requests your presence in the council chamber," he said. "There are matters that must be discussed, given what has happened." Lyra followed him through corridors she had not seen the night before, noting how the fortress looked entirely different in daylight, less like a place of fear, and more like an ordinary home, though grander than anything she had known in Thornfield. Servants moved about their duties, some glancing curiously in her direction, before quickly returning to their tasks, and Lyra felt every one of those glances like a small weight settling onto her shoulders. The council chamber was smaller than the main hall, dominated by a round table surrounded by high-backed chairs, most of them empty except for the one Cale occupied at its head. He looked as though he had not slept either, dark shadows beneath his eyes, though his posture remained rigid and controlled, every inch the king his people expected him to be. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair nearest him, and Lyra obeyed, though she kept her spine straight and her chin lifted, unwilling to show any weakness in front of him. "We need to discuss what happens next," Cale said without preamble. "Merrin believes the bond cannot be safely severed without proper understanding of its nature. That means, for now, you remain here." "For how long?" Lyra asked, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. "My brother does not have the luxury of time. Every day I remain here is a day closer to losing him." Cale's expression tightened slightly, though whether from her tone or the mention of her brother, she could not tell. "I have already sent riders to Thornfield with instructions to bring your brother here, where our healers can attend to him properly. If his condition is as severe as you claim, our resources will serve him better than anything available in a small border village." Lyra's breath caught, surprise and gratitude warring with suspicion in equal measure. "You would do that? Bring him here, care for him, without demanding anything in return?" "I am not entirely without mercy, despite what stories you may have heard," Cale said, a faint edge of dry humor coloring his otherwise serious tone. "And regardless of how this bond resolves itself, I have no interest in seeing an innocent child suffer for his sister's choices." Something in his words, gruff as they were, eased a fraction of the tension coiled tight in Lyra's chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it more than she expected to. Cale inclined his head slightly, accepting her gratitude without further comment, before shifting the conversation toward more difficult matters. "There is something else you should understand. This bond does not exist in isolation. It affects alliances, expectations, arrangements made long before either of us had any say in the matter." Lyra thought of the conversation she had overheard the night before, the mention of someone named Seraphine, and steeled herself for whatever explanation was coming. "I heard voices outside my door last night. Someone mentioned a name. Seraphine." Cale's jaw tightened visibly at the name, and for a moment, he said nothing, staring at some point on the table between them as though gathering his thoughts. "Seraphine Duval is the daughter of a powerful neighboring pack leader. Our families arranged a potential union between us years ago, intended to strengthen ties between our territories and secure protection along our shared border. Nothing had been finalized, but expectations existed, expectations now complicated significantly by what has happened between us." Lyra's stomach twisted uncomfortably. "So my presence here threatens something important to your kingdom." "It complicates things," Cale admitted. "Though I would not say your presence is the source of the threat. The bond formed regardless of either of our wishes. Blaming you for something neither of us chose accomplishes nothing." Despite his measured words, Lyra could not shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something far larger than a simple theft gone wrong, something with consequences reaching well beyond her own desperate need to save her brother. She studied Cale's face, searching for some sign of what he truly felt beneath that carefully controlled exterior, but found only the same guarded calm he seemed to wear at all times. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "For now, we learn to navigate this together," Cale said. "Marin will continue researching the nature of the bond, searching for answers about what it requires, and whether severing it safely remains possible. In the meantime, you will remain here, under my protection, and I would ask that you refrain from attempting to leave the fortress without informing someone first. The bond's effects on both of us remain unpredictable, and I would prefer neither of us come to harm through carelessness." Lyra nodded slowly, though the idea of remaining trapped within these walls, however comfortable, still sat uneasily with her. "And my brother? When will he arrive?" "Within a few days, if the roads remain clear," Cale said. "Once he is here, our healers will assess his condition and provide whatever treatment proves most effective." "Thank you," she said again, and this time, something almost like warmth flickered briefly across Cale's expression before he masked it once more behind his usual composure. The meeting concluded shortly after, and Dorian escorted Lyra back toward her chamber, though this time, he seemed slightly less guarded around her, as though the exchange he had witnessed had shifted something in his assessment of her. As they walked, Lyra found herself glancing back once toward the council chamber, where Cale remained behind, no doubt wrestling with decisions and pressures she could only begin to understand. Whatever this bond meant for either of their futures, she realized, walking beside a man who had, only hours earlier, been nothing more than a stranger guarding her escape route, that untangling it would require far more than simple patience. It would require both of them to confront truths about themselves neither had been prepared to face, truths that were only just beginning to surface, like the first cracks of light breaking through a long, unbroken night. 3 days passed before word arrived that Finn had reached the fortress gates, and Lyra was waiting in the courtyard long before the carriage rolled to a stop, her hands twisting anxiously in front of her. When the door finally opened and she saw her brother's thin, pale face peering out at the towering walls surrounding them, relief and heartbreak struck her at once, so powerful that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. "Finn!" she called, rushing forward as 2 attendants helped him down from the carriage. He looked even weaker than when she had left him, his skin nearly translucent, dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes, but when he saw her, a small, tired smile broke across his face. "You came back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told them you would." Lyra pulled him into a careful embrace, mindful of how fragile he had become, tears stinging her eyes despite her effort to remain composed. "Of course I came back. I promised you I would, and I always keep my promises." A woman stepped forward from among the fortress healers who had gathered to receive him, introducing herself as Alara, the fortress's chief healer, a calm and steady presence who immediately began assessing Finn's condition with practiced efficiency. Lyra watched anxiously as Alara examined him, checking his pulse, his eyes, the pallor of his skin, murmuring quiet observations to an assistant taking notes beside her. "The wasting sickness has progressed further than I would like," Alara said finally, straightening and turning to address Lyra directly. "But it has not progressed beyond hope. We have treatments here that may slow its advance significantly, perhaps even reverse some of the damage already done, though it will require time and careful monitoring." "Time is not something we have in abundance," Lyra said, fear sharpening her voice. Alara's expression softened slightly. "I understand your worry, but rushing treatment recklessly could do more harm than good. Trust that we will do everything within our ability to help him. For now, let us get him settled somewhere comfortable, where he can begin receiving proper care." Finn was taken to a chamber near Lyra's own, and she remained by his side for most of the afternoon, watching as Alara and her assistants administered the first treatments, a combination of herbal remedies and something Lyra did not recognize, a pale liquid that seemed to shimmer faintly when poured into a cup. Finn drank it obediently, though he made a face at the taste, and within a short while, color began returning, faint but noticeable, to his previously ashen cheeks. "It is working," Lyra breathed, relief flooding through her so intensely that she had to sit down beside his bed to steady herself. "It is a beginning," Alara corrected gently. "Healing takes time, especially with a condition as advanced as his. But yes, this is a good sign. Once Finn had fallen into a peaceful sleep, exhausted from the journey and the treatment, Lyra finally allowed herself to step outside his chamber, needing air and space to process everything that had happened. She found Cale waiting in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, as though he had been standing there for some time. "How is he?" Cale asked, straightening as she approached. "Better," she said, still slightly breathless with relief. "Alara believes the treatment is already showing results. I do not know how to properly thank you for this." "You do not need to thank me," Cale said, though something in his expression suggested her gratitude affected him more than he wanted to admit. "I told you I would see him cared for, and I meant it." They stood together in silence for a moment, the corridor quiet around them, and Lyra found herself studying his face more closely than she had allowed herself to before. Up close, without the shadow of fear and confusion clouding her earlier impressions, she noticed things she had missed, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as though perpetually braced for some unseen burden. "May I ask you something?" she said finally. He nodded, gesturing for her to continue. "Why did you order your guards not to harm me, that first night? You had every reason to treat me as a common thief, yet you did not." Cale considered the question for a long moment before answering. "When the bond first formed, I felt it, before I understood what it was. Something ancient and undeniable, tugging at instincts deeper than reason. Even without knowing why, some part of me understood that harming you would have consequences neither of us could undo. I trusted that instinct, even as my mind rebelled against it." Lyra absorbed his words carefully, turning them over in her thoughts. "Do you regret it? Trusting that instinct?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window at the end of the corridor, where afternoon light spilled golden across the stone floor. "I do not yet know what to feel about any of this," he admitted finally, honesty coloring his voice in a way she had not heard from him before. "This bond disrupts plans I have spent years building, expectations placed upon me since before I could understand their weight. And yet, standing here now, I cannot bring myself to regret the choice that kept you safe." Something warm unfurled in Lyra's chest at his admission, though she quickly pushed the feeling aside, unwilling to examine it too closely given everything still uncertain between them. "I understand what it means to carry expectations you never chose," she said instead. "My village depended on me for healing knowledge my mother passed down before she died. I never resented the responsibility, but I understand the weight of duty pressing against desires you are not always permitted to voice." Cale studied her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, something shifting in his expression that looked almost like recognition, as though he had found, unexpectedly, someone who understood a part of himself few others ever bothered to see. Before either of them could say more, footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and both turned to see Dorian approaching with an expression that immediately signaled trouble. "My lord," he said, slightly out of breath, "Seraphine Duval has arrived. She insists on speaking with you immediately, and she has brought a significant portion of her personal guard with her." Cale's entire posture shifted at the news, the warmth that had briefly softened his features hardening once more into careful control. Lyra watched the transformation with a sinking feeling in her stomach, understanding instinctively that whatever fragile connection they had begun building in this quiet corridor was about to be tested by forces far beyond either of their control. "I will see her in the main hall," Cale said, his voice clipped and formal once more. Dorian nodded and hurried off to relay the message, leaving Cale and Lyra alone for one final moment. "I should go," Cale said, though something in his tone suggested reluctance. "This conversation is not one I can avoid, given the circumstances." "I understand," Lyra said, though a strange unease settled over her at the thought of this woman. This Seraphine whose expected union with Cale had been disrupted so suddenly by events entirely outside anyone's control. Cale hesitated a moment longer, as though there was something else he wanted to say, before turning and striding down the corridor toward whatever confrontation awaited him. Lyra watched him go, her thoughts a tangled mess of relief over her brother's improving condition and growing apprehension about the woman now arriving to reclaim a future that fate had suddenly rewritten. She returned to Finn's chamber, finding him still sleeping peacefully, his breathing steadier than it had been in weeks, and allowed herself a small measure of comfort in that improvement. even as worry about the unfolding situation in the main hall gnawed steadily at the edges of her mind. It was Ren who found her there sometime later, slipping quietly into the chamber, with an expression that immediately told Lyra something significant had happened. "You should know what is being said throughout the fortress," Ren said quietly, careful not to wake Finn. "Seraphine is furious. She has demanded the king explain himself before the full council, and she has made it clear she does not intend to simply step aside because of an unexpected bond." Lyra's stomach tightened. "What does that mean for me?" Ren's expression turned sympathetic. "I do not know for certain, but Seraphine's family holds significant influence. If she pushes hard enough, she may attempt to have the bond challenged, perhaps even broken by force, regardless of the danger such an attempt might pose to either you or the king." Fear coiled cold and sharp through Lyra's chest at the thought, not entirely for herself, she realized with some surprise, but for Cale as well, for the man whose carefully guarded expression had briefly softened into something almost vulnerable in that quiet corridor conversation only hours before. Whatever storm was gathering within the main hall below, Lyra understood that it threatened far more than simple political arrangements. It threatened a connection that, despite every reason she had to resist it, had already begun rooting itself deeper into her heart than she was fully prepared to admit, even to herself. Unable to sit still, with worry gnawing at her thoughts, Lyra left Finn in the capable care of Alara's assistant and made her way quietly toward the main hall, drawn by a need to understand what was happening, rather than simply wait in uncertainty. She kept to the shadows near a side entrance, close enough to hear the voices carrying across the vast chamber, without announcing her presence. Seraphine stood near the center of the hall, tall and elegant, her dark hair pulled back in an intricate braid, her expression carved from cold fury barely restrained beneath a veneer of composure. Several members of her personal guard flanked her, their postures tense and watchful, while Cale stood opposite her, his own guards keeping a respectful distance. "You expect me to simply accept this," Seraphine was saying, her voice sharp enough to cut through stone. "Years of careful arrangement between our families, and you tell me a border village thief has somehow unraveled everything because of an accident with an old relic." "It was not an accident in the way you suggest," Cale replied, his voice measured despite the tension radiating from his frame. "The blade does not respond to accidents, it responds to recognition, something neither of us controlled or anticipated." Seraphine's laugh held no warmth. "Recognition. You expect the council, my family, our allies along the border, to accept that ancient magic simply decided our carefully built future meant nothing. This is absurd, Cale, and you know it as well as I do. I know that the bond exists, whether either of us finds it convenient or not," Cale said. "I have no intention of pretending otherwise, nor do I intend to make hasty decisions that could endanger lives simply to satisfy expectations formed before this happened." Seraphine stepped closer, her posture rigid with barely contained anger. "And what of the girl? Do you intend to elevate a common thief to a position she has no right to hold, simply because ancient magic made a mistake?" "It did not make a mistake," Cale said, his voice hardening slightly. "And regardless of what happens between us moving forward, I will not allow anyone to speak of her that way within these walls." Lyra's breath caught at his words, surprise and something warmer flooding through her chest, despite the tension of the moment. She had not expected him to defend her so firmly, especially in front of someone clearly capable of significant political retaliation. Seraphine's eyes narrowed, studying Cale's expression with a calculating sharpness that made Lyra's skin prickle with unease, even from a distance. "Interesting," she said softly, almost to herself. "You truly believe this, don't you? That there is something worth protecting here?" "I believe in dealing honestly with what is, rather than clinging to what was merely planned," Cale said. "I understand this disrupts arrangements important to both our families, and I am willing to discuss how we might address those concerns moving forward. But I will not sever a bond recklessly, nor will I dismiss the girl's safety to satisfy political convenience." Seraphine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally stepping back, her composure sliding back into place, like a mask carefully repositioned. "Very well," she said. "I will return to my family with this information, but understand, Cale, this matter will not simply resolve itself through patience and careful words. My father will demand answers, and if this bond truly cannot be broken, Our alliance faces consequences neither of us can afford to ignore. I understand the stakes, Kale said quietly. Do you? Seraphine asked, her voice suddenly softer, almost sad beneath its sharp edges. I wonder if you truly understand what you risk losing, Kale, chasing after something so uncertain. She turned then, gathering her guard with a sharp gesture, and swept from the hall without another word, leaving a heavy silence behind her that seemed to press against the very walls. Kale remained standing where she had left him, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as though replaying the conversation over in his mind. Lyra stepped back from her hiding place near the entrance, her heart pounding with a confusing mixture of relief and worry. Relief that Kale had defended her so firmly, and worry over what consequences that defiance might bring, both for him and for the fragile bond that had upended both their lives so suddenly. She returned to Finn's chamber before anyone could discover she had been listening, sitting quietly beside his sleeping form, as her thoughts churned with everything she had overheard. Seraphine's words lingered uncomfortably in her mind, particularly that final question, soft and almost sorrowful, about what Kale truly risked losing. Lyra did not know the full history between them, the years of arrangement and expectation Seraphine had referenced, but she understood enough to recognize that whatever existed between Kale and this woman was not simple political convenience alone. There was history there, perhaps even genuine affection once, now tangled and complicated by forces neither of them had chosen. It was well into the evening before Kale found her again, appearing quietly in the doorway of Finn's chamber, his expression tired but softer than it had been during the confrontation she witnessed earlier. I heard you were nearby during my conversation with Seraphine, he said, though his tone held no accusation, only a weary sort of acknowledgement. Lyra's cheeks warmed slightly, caught in her eavesdropping, though she saw no point in denying it. I am sorry. I should not have listened without your knowledge. Kale waved off her apology with a small shake of his head. You have every right to understand what affects your own situation. I would rather you know the truth than remain uncertain about the difficulties this bond has created. He stepped into the room, glancing briefly at Finn's sleeping form, before returning his attention to Lyra. I meant what I said to her, he added quietly. Whatever complications this bond has caused, I will not allow anyone to treat you as less than you deserve. Lyra held his gaze, something warm and uncertain unfurling in her chest at his words. Thank you, she said softly, though I understand this has cost you more than simple inconvenience. Seraphine mentioned years of arrangement between your families. I did not realize the history ran so deep. Kale's expression grew more guarded, though he did not turn away from the conversation as she half expected him to. Seraphine and I grew up together, in some respects. Our families have been allies for generations, and the expectation of our eventual union existed long before either of us had any say in the matter. I cannot claim it was ever built on deep affection, though I respected her, and I understood the importance of the alliance our families intended to secure. And now, Lyra asked carefully, that alliance stands threatened because of what happened between us. Now, Kale said, his voice quieter, more thoughtful than before, I find myself questioning whether an alliance built on obligation alone was ever truly worth the sacrifice it demanded, compared to a bond that, however inconvenient its timing, was chosen by something far older and more certain than either of our family's careful planning. His words hung in the quiet room, heavy with meaning neither of them seemed fully ready to name aloud. Lyra's heart raced at the implication threading through his careful phrasing, though she said nothing, unwilling to push a conversation that already felt fragile with unspoken possibility. Get some rest, Kale said finally, stepping back toward the doorway. Tomorrow brings enough challenges without exhaustion clouding either of our judgment tonight. He left before she could respond, and Lyra sat alone in the quiet chamber beside her sleeping brother, her thoughts a tangled storm of hope and uncertainty. Whatever complicated history existed between Kale and Seraphine, whatever political consequences their bond continued to stir throughout the fortress and beyond, Lyra could not deny the growing warmth taking root within her heart, however dangerous it might prove to nurture something neither fate nor circumstance had made simple. Sleep found her eventually, though it was thin and restless, filled with fragmented images of golden eyes and Seraphine's cold, calculating gaze, watching from somewhere just beyond reach. She woke before dawn, to the sound of Finn stirring in his bed, and when she opened her eyes to check on him, she found him sitting up, alert and clear-eyed, in a way she had not seen in weeks. "Lyra," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since before the sickness took hold. "I feel different, better. Whatever they gave me, it is working." She rushed to his side, checking his pulse, and the color returning steadily to his cheeks, tears of relief slipping free before she could stop them. "You look wonderful," she said, laughing despite herself. "I cannot believe how quickly this is working." Ilara arrived shortly after for her morning assessment, and her satisfied expression as she examined Finn confirmed what Lyra already suspected. "The treatment is responding even better than I hoped," Ilara said. "Continued care over the coming weeks should see him fully restored, stronger than he has been in years, if his body continues responding this well." The news lifted a weight from Lyra's chest that she had carried for so long. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. For the first time since she had set out toward the fortress, with nothing but desperation guiding her steps, she allowed herself to believe that everything might actually turn out well, for her brother at least, even as the tangled situation surrounding her bond with Kale remained far from resolved. She spent the morning with Finn, listening to him talk, with growing energy about small things, the shape of the clouds outside his window, the strange taste of the healing liquid Ilara had given him, questions about the fortress and the people who lived within it. His curiosity, so long dulled by illness, had returned in full force, and Lyra found herself smiling more in those few hours than she had in weeks. It was midday when Dorian appeared at the doorway, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately dampened the light mood of the morning. "The king requests your presence," he said to Lyra. "Marin has uncovered something regarding the bond, something she believes you both need to hear immediately." Lyra's stomach tightened with fresh apprehension, though she reassured Finn quickly before following Dorian through the fortress corridors toward Marin's chamber. Whatever the old seer had discovered, judging by the tension evident in Dorian's careful expression, it seemed unlikely to be simple or easily resolved, and Lyra braced herself as she approached the door, uncertain whether she was ready to learn just how deeply this ancient magic had already reshaped the course of her life. Kale was already waiting when she arrived, standing near the fire with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Marin sat in her usual chair, a heavy leather-bound book open across her lap, its pages yellowed with age and covered in handwriting so old the ink had faded to a faint brown. "Sit, child," Marin said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. "What I have found will take some explaining, and it deserves your full attention." Lyra sat, glancing briefly at Kale before turning her focus to the old seer. Marin closed the book gently and folded her hands atop its worn cover, her clouded eyes fixed somewhere between the two of them, as though she could see clearly enough despite their clouded surface. "I spent the past days searching through records kept by seers before me, going back generations, tracing every mention of the sacred blade and the bonds it has formed throughout its long history," Marin began. "What I discovered changes the nature of what we thought we understood." Thale straightened slightly, his attention sharpening. "Tell us." "The blade does not create bonds from nothing," Marin said. "It reveals them. Every bond it has ever formed existed already, woven into fate long before either party ever touched the metal. The blade simply makes visible what destiny had already decided, tearing away whatever illusions or plans stood in the way of a truth already written." Lyra's breath caught. "Are you saying Kale and I were always meant to be connected, regardless of the blade?" "I am saying the blade recognized something already present between you, something formed by forces older than either of your individual choices," Marin said. "Whether you wish to call it fate or destiny or simply the strange workings of ancient magic, the bond you now carry was never a mistake or an accident. It was always going to happen, in one form or another. The theft merely accelerated what time would have eventually revealed." Kale was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with visible difficulty. "Then there is truly no undoing this," he said finally, though his voice lacked the frustration it might have carried days earlier. It carried instead something closer to resignation, or perhaps, Lyra thought, something closer to acceptance. "There are always paths," Marin said carefully, "though I would caution against pursuing them lightly. Severing a bond the blade has revealed does not merely separate two people. It fights against the very fabric of fate itself, and such defiance rarely comes without significant cost. I have read of cases where attempts to break a revealed bond led to illness, madness, even death for those who tried. A heavy silence settled over the chamber at her words. Lyra glanced toward Cale, trying to read his expression, uncertain whether this news brought him relief or deeper dread, given everything at stake with Seraphine and the political alliances hanging in the balance. "What would you have us do, then?" Cale asked finally. "Live within it," Marin said simply. "Learn what the bond asks of you, and decide together how to honor what fate has revealed. The blade did not choose foolishly. Trust that, even when the path ahead seems uncertain." Cale thanked her quietly, though his expression remained troubled as he and Lyra left the chamber together, walking in silence through the fortress corridors, each lost in their own thoughts about what Marin's revelation truly meant. "I did not expect this," Cale admitted finally, breaking the silence as they reached a quiet balcony overlooking the eastern gardens, now bathed in the soft gold of late afternoon light. "I came into this expecting to find a way to release both of us from an inconvenient accident. Instead, I find myself told that nothing about this was ever accidental at all." Lyra leaned against the stone railing, watching the gardens below, her thoughts equally unsettled by the revelation. "Does that frighten you?" Cale considered the question honestly before answering. "It should, perhaps. It disrupts everything I believed about the path my life was meant to follow." And yet, he paused, glancing sideways at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something softer, more open than his usual careful composure. "Standing here now, I find the idea less frightening than I expected." Lyra's heart quickened at his words, warmth spreading through her chest despite every reasonable instinct telling her to remain cautious, given how complicated their circumstances truly were. "And what of Seraphine?" she asked quietly. "What of the alliance your family's built, the expectations placed on you long before fate decided otherwise?" Cale's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not look away from her. "I do not have easy answers to that question yet, but I will not pretend a bond fate itself revealed simply to satisfy arrangements made without either of our true consent. Seraphine deserves honesty, and I intend to give her that, whatever consequences follow." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower over the gardens, and Lyra found herself, for the first time since arriving at this fortress, feeling something close to peace amid all the uncertainty still surrounding her situation. That peace did not last long. A commotion erupted from somewhere within the fortress below, distant shouting carrying faintly on the evening breeze, and both Cale and Lyra turned sharply toward the sound. Moments later, Dorian appeared at the balcony entrance, his expression grim. "My lord," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "There has been an incident near the eastern gate. A group claiming allegiance to Seraphine's family attempted to breach the fortress grounds, demanding the immediate return of the sacred blade to what they called its rightful place, insisting the bond be forcibly severed for the good of both territories." Cale's expression hardened instantly, all traces of the softness Lyra had glimpsed only moments before vanishing beneath a sharp, protective anger. "Are they contained?" "They have been turned back for now," Dorian said, though tensions remain high. "Several of our guards were injured in the confrontation, though none severely. I fear this may only be the beginning of more direct challenges to come." Cale's gaze flicked toward Lyra, something fierce and protective flashing across his features before he composed himself once more. "Increase security around the fortress, particularly near Lyra's and her brother's quarters," he ordered. "I want guards stationed at every entrance, and I want to know immediately if anyone attempts to approach either of them without my direct authorization." Dorian nodded and hurried off to relay the orders, leaving Cale and Lyra alone once more on the balcony, though the peaceful atmosphere from moments before had shattered entirely, replaced by a tension that pressed heavily against them both. "They will not stop simply because Marin has explained the nature of the bond," Lyra said quietly, fear creeping into her voice despite her effort to remain steady. "Seraphine's family will not accept fate as sufficient justification for losing an alliance they consider essential." "No," Cale agreed, his voice grim. "They will not. Which means we must prepare for the possibility that this conflict grows more dangerous before it resolves itself." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious, though beneath the seriousness, Lyra could see genuine concern etched into every line of his face. "I will not allow anything to happen to you, or to your brother," he said firmly. "Whatever challenges arise from this bond, whatever political consequences follow, your safety remains my priority." Lyra held his gaze, something steady and certain settling into her chest, despite the fear still coiling through her thoughts. "I believe you," she said softly, and found, to her own surprise, that she truly meant it. As darkness fell over the fortress, and the sounds of increased guard activity echoed faintly through the corridors below, Lyra understood that whatever fragile peace she and Cale had begun building together now faced a threat far more immediate and dangerous than political disapproval alone. Seraphine's family had shown their willingness to act, and Lyra could only wonder, with growing unease, how much further they might be willing to go to reclaim the future they believed had been unfairly stolen from them. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to fortress life, one shaped by heightened caution and quiet vigilance. Guards doubled their patrols along the outer walls, and Lyra noticed how carefully Dorian tracked her movements whenever she left her chamber, always ensuring at least one trusted warrior remained nearby. She did not resent the added protection, not after witnessing firsthand how quickly danger could arrive uninvited, but the constant awareness of threat wore steadily at her nerves. Finn's recovery continued to progress remarkably well, and within a week, he had regained enough strength to walk short distances unassisted, his curiosity about the fortress drawing him toward the training yard one afternoon, while Lyra accompanied him, grateful to see him moving freely after so many months of illness confining him to bed. "They fight so differently than the warriors back home," Finn observed, watching a group of fortress soldiers practicing hand-to-hand combat beneath the watchful eye of an instructor. "Faster, more controlled." "They train from childhood here," a voice said from behind them, and Lyra turned to find Cale approaching, dressed simply, without the formal bearing he usually carried during council matters. "This is the first time I have seen him look almost relaxed," she realized, noting the easier set of his shoulders, the faint warmth in his expression, as he studied Finn with open curiosity. "Would you like to learn something?" he asked Finn directly. "Nothing strenuous, given your recovery, but perhaps a few basic movements, if your sister permits it." Finn's eyes lit up with excitement, and Lyra found herself smiling, despite the underlying tension still coloring most of her days. "If Alara approves," she said, though the way Finn's face brightened told her she would find little resistance from that direction either. Over the following hour, Lyra watched as Cale patiently guided Finn through simple stances and movements, adjusting his footing gently, offering quiet encouragement whenever Finn stumbled or grew frustrated with his still limited strength. She had not expected to see this side of him, this patient, almost gentle demeanor, so different from the guarded authority he presented during matters of state, and something in her chest tightened pleasantly as she watched him kneel down to Finn's level, explaining a movement with careful, genuine attention. "He is good with him," Ren commented, appearing beside Lyra with a tray of refreshments she had brought for the training yard. "I have not seen the king this at ease in a long while. Whatever burdens he usually carries, your brother seems to lighten them, if only for an afternoon." Lyra watched a moment longer, warmth spreading through her chest, as Finn laughed at something Cale said, the sound so bright and unburdened that tears pricked unexpectedly at her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, not entirely certain whether she spoke to Ren, to Cale, or simply to whatever strange fate had brought them all together within these walls. The peaceful afternoon shattered abruptly, when a sharp cry rang out from the northern watchtower, followed immediately by the deep, urgent blast of a warning horn. Every soldier in the training yard snapped instantly to attention, weapons drawn, formations shifting with practiced efficiency, as Cale straightened, all traces of the relaxed demeanor from moments before, vanishing beneath sharp, commanding focus. "Take them inside," he ordered Dorian, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere at the sound of the horn. "Lower halls, full lockdown, until we understand what has triggered the alarm." Dorian moved quickly, ushering Lyra and Finn toward the fortress interior, while Cale strode toward the northern wall, shouting orders to the assembled guards. Lyra glanced back once, catching a final glimpse of him disappearing among his warriors, fear twisting sharp and sudden in her stomach at the uncertainty of what threat had triggered such an immediate response. They were led to a secure chamber deep within the fortress, windowless and heavily guarded, where several other fortress residents had already gathered, murmuring anxiously among themselves. Finn gripped Lyra's hand tightly, his earlier excitement replaced by wide-eyed apprehension, and she squeezed his fingers reassuringly, though her own heart pounded with equal uncertainty. "What is happening?" Finn whispered. "I do not know," Lyra admitted honestly, unwilling to offer false comfort when she herself understood so little about the danger unfolding somewhere beyond these protective walls. They waited for what felt like hours, though Lyra suspected it was closer to one, the tension in the room thick enough to taste, before Dorian finally returned, his expression grim but not panicked, which offered some small measure of relief. "The threat has been contained," he announced to the room at large, though his gaze found Lyra specifically as he continued. "A group attempted to breach the northern wall under cover of the training exercises, likely hoping the activity would mask their approach. They were repelled before reaching the inner grounds, though not without difficulty." "Was anyone hurt?" Lyra asked immediately. "Several injuries among our guards. None fatal," Dorian said. The king insisted on leading the response personally, and sustained a minor wound himself, though he refused to leave the field until the threat was fully cleared. Lyra's stomach dropped at the news, fear for Kale's safety overriding every other concern crowding her thoughts. Where is he now? Is he safe? "Resting. Under Alara's care," Dorian said. "He asked that I bring you to him once the lockdown lifted, if you were willing." Lyra did not hesitate, leaving Finn in the capable care of Ren, who had joined them partway through the confinement, and following Dorian quickly through corridors that felt far longer than she remembered, her heart racing with worry the entire way. She found Kale in a private chamber near the healer's quarters, seated on the edge of a bed, while Alara finished bandaging a wound along his forearm, the cloth already darkening slightly with blood despite her careful work. He looked up as Lyra entered, and despite the evident pain tightening the corners of his eyes, something in his expression softened immediately at the sight of her. "You should not be troubling yourself over a minor wound," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested he intended. "Minor or not, I was worried," Lyra said, crossing the room and kneeling beside the bed to examine the wound herself, old habits from years of tending injured travelers guiding her movements without conscious thought. "This needs cleaning more thoroughly before it is wrapped," she added, glancing at Alara. "The edges show early signs of irritation." Alara raised an eyebrow, clearly recognizing genuine skill in Lyra's assessment, and stepped back to allow her access. "Please, be my guest. I would welcome a second opinion, given how stubborn our king proved about accepting treatment in the first place." Lyra worked carefully, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency, while Kale watched her with an expression of quiet fascination, as though seeing an entirely new side of her revealed through her steady, capable hands. "You are skilled at this," he observed. "I have had considerable practice," she said, focusing on her work rather than meeting his gaze directly, though she was acutely aware of his attention fixed on her throughout the careful process. "My mother trained me from childhood, and our village rarely had access to healers beyond what I could provide myself." When she finished, wrapping the wound with clean cloth Alara provided, she finally allowed herself to meet his eyes, finding an intensity there that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Thank you," he said quietly, though something in his tone suggested his gratitude extended beyond simple medical care. "You should not have led the response yourself, given the danger," Lyra said, worry still coloring her voice despite the wound now properly tended. "You are too important to risk so recklessly." Kale's expression grew serious, his gaze holding hers steadily. "I could not stand aside while my people faced danger, meant to threaten what I have chosen to protect," he said. "And that includes you, Lyra, especially you." The quiet admission hung between them, heavy with meaning neither had fully voiced before, and Lyra felt her heart racing at the openness in his words, at the vulnerability he allowed himself to show despite everything still uncertain and dangerous surrounding their situation. Whatever Seraphine's family intended by this attack, whatever further challenges awaited them in the days ahead, Lyra understood with sudden, undeniable clarity that she no longer wished to fight against the bond connecting her to this man, however complicated and dangerous the path forward might prove to be. In the days following the attack, the fortress settled into a wary calm, though the increased security remained firmly in place. Kale's wound healed steadily under Alara's continued care, and Lyra found herself visiting him often during his recovery, their conversations gradually shifting from cautious formality into something warmer and more comfortable, the careful distance between them narrowing with each shared moment. She learned things about him she had not expected, small details that painted a fuller picture of the man beneath the crown. He preferred quiet mornings before the fortress fully woke, often walking the eastern gardens alone with his thoughts. He had lost his own mother young, much like Lyra had lost hers, and the shared understanding of that particular grief created an unexpected closeness between them, a recognition of similar wounds carried quietly beneath very different lives. In turn, Kale learned about her village, about the years she had spent tending to neighbors and strangers alike, with little more than herbal knowledge and careful hands, about the quiet determination that had carried her across dangerous roads to steal from a fortress she had every reason to fear. "You never once considered failure," he observed one evening, as they sat together in the eastern garden beneath a sky scattered with early stars, the scent of night-blooming flowers drifting softly around them. "Even knowing the risk, you pressed forward regardless." "Failure was not an option I could afford to consider," Lyra said honestly. "Finn needed me to succeed, and dwelling on the possibility of failure would have accomplished nothing beyond paralyzing me with fear at the moment I needed courage most." Kale studied her with quiet admiration, something warm and steady in his gaze that made her pulse quicken, despite the calm evening air surrounding them. "You are remarkable," he said simply, the words carrying a sincerity that left no room for doubt regarding his meaning. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to such direct admiration, though she found she did not wish to deflect it as she might have once. "Thank you," she said softly. "Though I would say the same of you, ruling a kingdom, carrying the weight of expectations from every direction, and still finding patience for a frightened boy, eager to learn simple training movements. That speaks to a kindness few would expect from someone with your reputation." Kale's expression shifted, something almost self-deprecating flickering across his features. "My reputation exists for good reason," he admitted. "I have made difficult decisions throughout my rule, decisions that required a coldness I am not always proud of, though I believe them necessary to protect what matters most. I did not expect, when this bond first formed, that it would reveal parts of myself I had long forgotten how to access." "What parts?" Lyra asked quietly, genuinely curious. Kale was silent for a moment, considering his answer carefully before speaking. "The part that remembers joy, exists beyond duty," he said finally. "The part that finds comfort in simple conversation, rather than calculated political maneuvering. I had grown so accustomed to viewing every interaction through the lens of strategy and consequence, that I forgot what it felt like to simply enjoy someone's company, without ulterior motive clouding the moment." Lyra's heart swelled at his admission, and without fully deciding to do so, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing gently with his. The familiar warmth of the bond surged between them at the contact, though gentler now, less overwhelming than their first encounters, settling instead into something steady and comforting, like a fire banked low but constant. "I am glad, whatever else this bond has complicated, that it brought us this," she said softly. Kale turned his hand to properly clasp hers, his thumb tracing gentle patterns against her skin, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "As am I. More than I know how to properly express." They sat together in comfortable silence beneath the stars for a long while after that, neither rushing to fill the quiet with unnecessary words, content simply to exist together in a moment, untouched, for now, by the political dangers still simmering beyond the garden walls. But that peace, however precious, could not last indefinitely. 2 days later, word arrived that Seraphine's father had formally petitioned the wider regional council, demanding an official inquiry into the legitimacy of the bond, and insisting on the right to challenge its validity, through ancient trial rights, rarely invoked in recent generations. Kale received the news in the council chamber, his expression darkening as Dorian relayed the details, and Lyra, present at his request during the discussion, felt dread coil tight in her stomach at the implications. "What does this trial entail?" she asked, once Dorian had finished his report. Marin, who had joined the council for this particular discussion, answered before Kale could speak. "The trial rights are ancient, rarely used because of their inherent danger. They require both bonded individuals to undergo a series of tests designed to prove the bond's legitimacy before witnesses from allied territories. Failure to pass these tests results in forced severance of the bond, regardless of consent, through methods that have historically proven fatal to at least one party involved in roughly a third of recorded attempts." The room fell silent at the grim statistic, and Lyra felt the blood drain from her face as the true danger of Seraphine's petition settled fully into her understanding. "Can this petition be denied?" Cale asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Not without significant political cost," Marin said gravely. "Refusing to submit to a formally invoked ancient trial would be seen as an admission of illegitimacy, undermining not only this bond, but potentially your authority as Alpha King in the eyes of allied territories who value tradition above all else." Cale's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists atop the council table, and Lyra reached instinctively for his arm, offering what comfort she could despite the fear now roaring through her own chest. "Then we prepare," he said finally, his voice hard with resolve despite the danger now looming ahead of them. "Whatever this trial demands, we will face it together, and we will prove beyond any doubt that this bond deserves to stand." Lyra held his gaze, drawing strength from the fierce determination burning there, though beneath her own resolve, fear still lingered, cold and persistent, at the thought of trials capable of ending in death for either of them. Whatever Seraphine's family hoped to accomplish through this dangerous gambit, Lyra understood now that the coming days would demand more courage from both of them than anything they had yet faced, and the outcome would determine far more than simply the fate of their bond. It would determine whether they survived to have any future together at all. Preparations for the trial began immediately, and the fortress transformed around Lyra in ways she could scarcely have imagined only weeks earlier. Marin spent long hours explaining the ancient rites in careful detail, describing 3 separate tests that awaited them, each designed to prove different aspects of a bond's legitimacy before the gathered witnesses. "The first test examines physical resilience," Marin explained during one such session, the 3 of them gathered in her chamber surrounded by old texts and scattered notes. Both bonded individuals must endure a shared trial of endurance, their combined strength measured against a challenge calibrated to test the depth of their connection. A true bond lends strength beyond what either party could achieve alone. "And if the bond is not strong enough to provide that strength?" Lyra asked, already dreading the answer. "Then the trial reveals its own truth," Marin said simply, not unkindly, though the implication remained clear enough. "The second test," Marin continued, "examines trust, requiring each bonded individual to face a challenge blind to the other's actions, trusting entirely in their partner's judgment, without the ability to verify or guide. The final test examines sacrifice, the most dangerous of the 3, requiring proof that each bonded individual values the other's well-being above their own safety." Lyra absorbed this information with growing unease, though beside her, Cale remained largely silent, his expression carefully controlled despite the evident tension in his shoulders. "How much time do we have to prepare?" he asked finally. 2 weeks, Marin said. "The council has set the date according to tradition, time to the coming full moon, when ancient magic runs strongest, and any deception becomes most difficult to hide." 2 weeks did not feel like nearly enough time to Lyra, though she said nothing, understanding that dwelling on the inadequacy of their preparation would accomplish nothing beyond deepening her own anxiety. Instead, she resolved to use every available hour, making certain that whatever bond existed between herself and Cale grew as strong and true as possible before the trial arrived. The following days fell into a demanding rhythm. Mornings began with physical training alongside Cale, building the kind of stamina and coordinated strength the first trial would likely demand, though neither of them knew precisely what form that endurance test might take. Cale proved a patient but exacting instructor, pushing her steadily, without ever crossing into cruelty, always attentive to her limits, even as he encouraged her to expand them. "You move well for someone without formal training," he observed one morning, watching her execute a defensive stance he had taught her days earlier, with markedly improved precision. "I told you, years spent tending to injured travelers taught me a great deal about how bodies move and where their vulnerabilities lie," Lyra said, slightly breathless from the exertion. "Understanding weakness is not so different from understanding strength." Cale smiled, a rare and genuine expression that never failed to send warmth curling through her chest whenever she managed to draw it from him. "A healer's perspective applied to combat," he said. "I would not have thought of it that way, though I suspect you are entirely correct." Afternoons were spent with Marin, studying the trust exercises she believed would prove most useful, practices designed to strengthen the intuitive connection the bond provided, teaching Lyra and Kale to sense each other's presence and intentions, even without direct communication. It proved slow, frustrating work at first, but gradually, Lyra began noticing subtle shifts in awareness, a growing sense of Kale's emotional state, even when he stood across the room, a faint pull toward his location, whenever they were separated within the fortress. The bond grows stronger with deliberate attention, Marin explained, pleased with their progress. This is precisely why the trial exists as it does. A bond built on true connection strengthens under pressure. A bond built on convenience or coercion tends instead to fracture. Evenings, when the demanding preparations finally allowed for rest, Lyra spent time with Finn, whose recovery continued steadily, his strength returning day by day, until he could join the younger fortress residents in simple games within the training yard, his laughter ringing bright and unburdened across grounds that had once felt so foreign and threatening to Lyra during her desperate arrival. "He seems happy here," Kale observed one evening, watching Finn from a distance, as he played alongside several other children his age, all clearly delighted by his presence among them. "He is," Lyra agreed, warmth swelling in her chest at the sight. "I worried, when I first considered bringing him this far from everything familiar, that the change would prove too difficult for him. Instead, he has found more joy here than I have seen from him in years. Perhaps some journeys, however frightening at their outset, lead us precisely where we are meant to be," Kale said quietly, and Lyra glanced up to find him watching her rather than Finn, his expression carrying a warmth that made her breath catch in her throat. The growing closeness between them did not go unnoticed throughout the fortress. Wren often mentioned the shift in mood among the staff, how conversations about the king's newfound warmth had spread through the corridors with the particular speed reserved for hopeful gossip. Even Dorian, whose wariness toward Lyra had persisted longer than most, gradually softened, offering small kindnesses and quiet approval whenever their paths crossed during the demanding preparation schedule. Not everyone within the fortress shared this growing goodwill, however. Lyra began noticing certain servants who watched her with undisguised suspicion, murmurs that quieted abruptly whenever she approached particular gatherings, small signs suggesting that Seraphine's influence extended further into the fortress than anyone had initially suspected. She mentioned her concerns to Kale one evening, unwilling to let unfounded suspicion fester unaddressed, given how much now depended on trust and unity within these walls. "I have noticed the same," Kale admitted grimly. "Dorian has already begun a quiet investigation into staff loyalty, though uncovering hidden allegiances proves difficult without solid evidence to guide our suspicions." "Do you truly believe someone here might work against us?" Lyra asked, unease settling cold in her stomach at the thought. "I believe Seraphine's family understands the value of information gathered from within these walls," Kale said carefully. "Whether that translates into active sabotage or simply careful observation, I cannot yet say with certainty, but I would ask that you remain cautious, particularly as the trial approaches. Trust only those whose loyalty has been clearly demonstrated." His warning settled uneasily over the remaining days of their preparation, adding a layer of watchfulness to what had already become an exhausting routine of training and study. Lyra found herself glancing more carefully at unfamiliar faces throughout the fortress, wondering which among the many servants and guards might harbor loyalties working actively against the fragile connection she and Kale continued building together. 10 days before the trial, that wariness proved justified in the worst possible way. Lyra had gone to check on a shipment of herbs Alara had requested for Finn's continuing treatment, a routine errand that took her toward the fortress storerooms in the lower halls, an area less frequented than the main living quarters above. As she searched through the labeled containers, she heard voices drifting from an adjacent chamber, low and hurried, speaking in tones that immediately raised her suspicion. She should have listened to instinct and left immediately, but curiosity, sharpened by Kale's earlier warning, drew her closer to the door instead, and what she overheard sent ice flooding through her veins. "The trial will provide the perfect opportunity," one voice was saying, unfamiliar but carrying an accent she recognized from the guards who had accompanied Seraphine's earlier visit. "If the girl weakens during the endurance test, no one will suspect foul play. The strain alone would explain any collapse." "And the substance will not be detected?" a second voice asked. "Not if administered carefully, in the food prepared specifically for her before the trial begins," the first voice confirmed. By the time anyone realizes what has happened, the bond will have already failed under the weight of the trial, and Seraphine's claim will stand unchallenged. Lyra's heart pounded so violently, she feared the sound alone might give away her presence, and she backed away from the door slowly, carefully, forcing herself to move with deliberate quiet, despite the panic screaming through every nerve in her body. She needed to warn Cale immediately, needed to expose this plot before it had any chance of succeeding, but as she turned to hurry back toward the main corridor, her foot caught against a loose stone, and the sound of her stumble echoed far too loudly through the quiet storeroom. The voices beyond the door fell silent instantly, and Lyra did not wait to discover whether she had been noticed. She ran, her heart in her throat, praying she could reach safety, before whoever lurked in that chamber decided a witness to their conspiracy could not be allowed to escape. She did not stop running until she reached the main hall, breathless and shaking, her mind racing through everything she had overheard. Guards near the entrance, startled at her sudden appearance, but she pushed past their questions, demanding to know where Cale could be found, her urgency clear enough that no one dared delay her further. She found him in the training yard, reviewing formations with several of his senior warriors, and the moment he caught sight of her expression, he immediately excused himself, crossing the distance between them with quick, purposeful strides. "What happened?" he asked, concern sharpening his voice as he took in her disheveled appearance and evident distress. Lyra told him everything: the voices in the storeroom, the plan to poison her food before the trial, the careful scheme designed to make her collapse appear as simple exhaustion, rather than deliberate sabotage. Cale's expression darkened with each word, fury building steadily beneath his controlled exterior until his hands had curled into tight fists at his sides. "Did you see their faces?" he asked when she finished. "No," Lyra admitted. "I only heard their voices, and I did not recognize either of them clearly enough to identify who they were." Cale called immediately for Dorian, relaying the information with sharp, efficient precision, and within minutes, guards had been dispatched to search the lower storerooms, though Lyra suspected, with a sinking feeling, that whoever had been plotting there had likely already fled upon hearing her stumble against the loose stone. The search confirmed her fears. The storerooms stood empty by the time guards arrived, no trace remaining of whoever had gathered there, beyond a faint, unfamiliar scent that Dorian's trackers identified as belonging to someone not native to the fortress, likely a visitor who had arrived during Seraphine's earlier delegation and remained behind under some pretense. "We will increase security around your meals immediately," Dorian assured her, once the search had concluded without result. "Every dish will be tasted and verified before reaching you, and I will personally oversee the process until the trial concludes." Despite the reassurance, Lyra found little comfort in the knowledge that someone within these walls, someone she may have passed in the corridors without suspicion, had been plotting something dangerous enough to potentially kill her, all to ensure Seraphine's claim against the bond succeeded without genuine challenge. Cale remained close beside her for the rest of that difficult day, his presence a steady, protective warmth she found herself leaning into more than she might have expected only weeks earlier. That evening, as they sat together in the same garden that had become their quiet refuge from the mounting pressures surrounding them, he finally voiced the fear that had clearly been building since her revelation. "I cannot lose you to something so cowardly," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. "Not after everything we have built together these past weeks, not to some hidden poison meant to make your death appear accidental." "You will not lose me," Lyra said firmly, reaching for his hand and holding it tightly within her own. "I did not survive a desperate journey across dangerous roads, or the theft of an ancient relic from the most feared fortress in the territory, simply to fall to poison, administered by cowards too afraid to face either of us directly." Cale's grip tightened around her hand, though his expression remained troubled. "I should have anticipated this. I should have protected you more carefully from the very beginning." "You could not have known," Lyra said gently. "None of us could have anticipated how far Seraphine's family would go to reclaim what they believe was unfairly taken from them. But now that we know, we can prepare, and we can ensure their cowardice does not succeed in undermining everything we have built." He studied her for a long moment, something fierce and determined settling into his expression as he absorbed her words, before finally nodding, resolve replacing the earlier fear that had briefly clouded his features. Together then, he said quietly. Whatever comes in these final days before the trial, we face it together, and we do not allow fear to weaken what fate itself has already declared true between us. Together, Lyra agreed, and as they sat beneath the darkening sky, hands still clasped tightly between them, she felt the bond pulse warm and steady beneath her skin, a quiet reassurance that whatever dangers still lay ahead, they would not face them alone. The remaining days before the trial passed, in a blur of careful preparation and quiet vigilance. True to his word, Dorian personally verified every meal that reached Lyra's chamber, and no further attempts against her safety surfaced, though the underlying tension never fully faded, a constant reminder that someone within these walls remained willing to see her harmed, for the sake of political convenience. The morning of the full moon arrived with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, the sky stretching cloudless and pale above the fortress, as delegations from allied territories began arriving throughout the day, their banners and colors filling the courtyard with a solemn ceremony Lyra had never witnessed before. She watched from her chamber window as carriages and mounted riders passed through the gates, representatives from packs she had only heard mentioned in passing, all gathering to witness whether her bond with Kale would stand or shatter beneath the weight of ancient trial. Ren helped her dress that afternoon in ceremonial clothing provided specifically for the occasion, simple but elegant robes in deep silver that Marin had explained carried symbolic significance tied to the bonding rites themselves. Lyra studied her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the composed figure staring back at her, though beneath the calm exterior, her heart raced with an anxiety she could not fully suppress. "You look ready," Ren said softly, adjusting a final fold of fabric with careful attention. "I do not feel ready," Lyra admitted honestly. "No one ever truly feels ready for something like this," Ren said, offering a reassuring smile. "But readiness and courage are not always the same thing. I have watched you these past weeks, and courage is something you possess in abundance, whatever doubts linger beneath the surface." Lyra found small comfort in her words, though nothing could fully calm the storm of nerves building steadily as the appointed hour approached. When Dorian arrived to escort her toward the ceremonial grounds prepared just beyond the fortress walls, she found Kale waiting near the entrance, dressed in formal attire that emphasized the weight and authority of his position, though his expression softened immediately upon seeing her. "You look remarkable," he said quietly, taking her hand as they walked together toward the gathered assembly. "I am terrified," Lyra admitted, unwilling to hide the truth from him given everything they had built together these past weeks. "As am I," Kale confessed, surprising her with his honesty. "But we face this fear together, exactly as we agreed. Whatever the trial demands, remember that the bond between us is real, proven already through everything we have endured. Trust in that truth, and trust in me, as I trust in you." His words steadied her more than she expected, and by the time they reached the ceremonial grounds, a wide circle marked by ancient stones arranged beneath the open sky, she had gathered enough composure to face the assembled witnesses with her chin lifted and her spine straight, refusing to show the fear still coiled tight beneath her calm exterior. Seraphine stood among the witnesses, her expression carved from cold satisfaction, clearly confident that whatever trial awaited them would expose the bond as insufficient to withstand ancient scrutiny. Beside her stood an older man, Lyra assumed to be her father, his posture rigid with the same barely concealed hostility his daughter carried so openly. Marin stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, her voice carrying clearly despite its age-worn rasp, explaining the nature of the trial about to unfold, the 3 tests designed to prove the legitimacy of the bond beyond any reasonable doubt. Lyra listened with growing apprehension, though she kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to grant Seraphine the satisfaction of visible fear. The first test began shortly after Marin's introduction concluded. Lyra and Kale were led to the center of the stone circle, where a series of heavy stones had been arranged in a challenging configuration, each marked with ancient symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly beneath the fading afternoon light. "You must move these stones from one side of the circle to the other before the moon reaches its highest point," Marin explained. "Working together, combining your strength, trusting the bond to carry you through exhaustion that would otherwise prove insurmountable alone." The stones proved heavier than anything Lyra had ever attempted to lift, and within the first several attempts, Her muscles burned with a strain that made her wonder whether her body could truly endure what the trial demanded. But as she worked alongside Kale, their movements gradually falling into a rhythm neither had consciously planned, she felt something shift between them, a subtle current of shared strength flowing through the bond connecting them, lending her reserves of endurance she had not known she possessed. "Focus on me," Kale murmured during a brief pause between stones, his own breathing labored from the exertion. "Let the bond carry what your body alone cannot." Lyra nodded, closing her eyes briefly to center herself, and when she reached for the next stone, she felt it distinctly, a warmth spreading from her chest outward, steadying her trembling muscles, easing the burn that had begun creeping into her joints. Together, they moved stone after stone, the physical strain never fully vanishing, but growing more bearable with each shared effort, until finally, as the moon crested toward its highest point in the darkening sky, the final stone settled into place on the opposite side of the circle. A murmur rippled through the assembled witnesses, and Marin stepped forward once more, her expression carrying something close to satisfaction as she examined the completed arrangement. "The first trial is past," she announced. "The bond has proven capable of lending strength beyond what either individual could achieve alone." Lyra glanced toward Seraphine, finding her expression tight with poorly concealed frustration, though she quickly masked it behind practiced composure. One trial down, two remained, and Lyra knew from Marin's earlier explanation that the coming tests would prove even more demanding than the physical endurance they had just survived. They were given a brief respite before the second trial began, time enough to catch their breath and drink water offered by attentive fortress staff, though the tension of the gathered crowd never fully eased, every witness watching with sharp, evaluating eyes. "The second trial," Marin explained once the assembly had settled once more, "examines trust. Lyra will be blindfolded and led through a path scattered with obstacles, dangers that could cause genuine harm if navigated poorly. Kale must guide her through voice alone, unable to touch or physically assist her, relying entirely on the bond's connection and his own careful direction to see her safely through." Lyra's stomach tightened at the explanation, fear coiling sharp through her chest at the thought of navigating unknown dangers blind, trusting entirely in a voice she could not always clearly track amid the noise of gathered witnesses. But when she glanced toward Kale, finding steady confidence in his gaze despite the obvious weight of responsibility now settling onto his shoulders, some of that fear eased into something closer to determination. "I trust you," she said quietly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Kale held her gaze a moment longer before nodding, his own expression firming with resolve. "Then trust carries us through this, exactly as it should." A thick blindfold was secured over her eyes, plunging her into disorienting darkness, and Lyra felt panic flutter briefly in her chest before she forced herself to breathe steadily, focusing instead on the faint, warm pulse of the bond still humming quietly beneath her skin, a tether connecting her to Kale even without sight to guide her. "Step forward," his voice called, clear and steady, despite the murmur of the crowd surrounding them. 3 steps, then pause. She obeyed, her hands slightly outstretched, though she had been instructed to keep them at her sides, trusting his direction completely as she counted the steps carefully. "Now, shift right, avoiding what lies directly ahead," Kale continued, his voice never wavering despite whatever obstacle he clearly saw approaching in her path. Lyra shifted as instructed, and a moment later, she heard something heavy shift nearby, close enough that she understood instinctively she had narrowly avoided some manner of trap or hazard positioned along her path. Her heart raced, but she kept moving forward, guided entirely by the steady, unwavering direction of his voice. The path continued in this manner, Kale calling out instructions with careful precision, guiding her around hazards she could not see, through turns and pauses that required absolute trust in his judgment. Several times her instincts screamed to deviate from his instructions, to trust her own sense of caution over directions she could not verify, but each time, she forced herself to obey regardless, remembering her promise, remembering the steady warmth of the bond assuring her that he would not lead her astray. Near the end of the path, his voice grew suddenly sharper, more urgent than before. "Stop, immediately, do not take another step." Lyra froze instantly, her heart pounding at the sudden shift in his tone, though she trusted his instruction without question. Standing perfectly still, despite every instinct urging her to understand what danger lay directly ahead. "Now, step back, 3 paces, slowly," he continued, and she obeyed, retreating carefully, until his voice indicated she had cleared whatever hazard had prompted his urgent warning. "Good," he said, audible relief coloring his tone. "Now forward again, angling slightly left." She followed his guidance for what felt like an eternity longer, though in truth, only a few more minutes passed before his voice finally called out with unmistakable warmth and relief. "You have reached the end. You may remove the blindfold." Lyra's trembling hands pulled the fabric away, and she found herself standing at the edge of the ceremonial circle. The obstacle path stretched behind her, revealing hazards she had navigated blind, pits and sharpened stakes, and other dangers that could have caused genuine harm had she deviated even slightly from Kale's careful direction. Relief flooded through her so intensely her knees nearly buckled, and Kale crossed the distance between them quickly, steadying her with hands that trembled slightly despite his best effort to remain composed. "You did wonderfully," he murmured, close enough that only she could hear the words clearly amid the murmuring crowd. "We did wonderfully," she corrected softly, and something in his expression softened further at her insistence on shared credit for what they had just accomplished together. Maren stepped forward once more, her voice carrying clear satisfaction as she addressed the assembled witnesses. "The second trial is past. Trust between them has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. Only one trial remained, the most dangerous of the 3 according to Maren's earlier explanation, the test of sacrifice." And as Lyra caught sight of Seraphine's tightening expression among the gathered crowd, she understood with grim certainty that whatever this final challenge demanded, it would test them more severely than anything they had yet faced. Night had fully fallen by the time preparations for the 3rd trial began, the moon now hanging high and bright directly overhead, bathing the ceremonial circle in silver light that gave the entire scene an otherworldly quality. Maren stepped forward once more, and this time, her expression carried none of the earlier satisfaction, replaced instead by grave solemnity that immediately heightened Lyra's unease. "The final trial requires proof of sacrifice," she explained, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed assembly. "Each of you will face a moment of genuine danger, a test administered by the ancient rite itself, rather than by human hands. The bond must prove strong enough that each of you would willingly place yourself in harm's way to protect the other. There is no way to prepare for what form this test will take, as the rite determines the nature of the danger, based on truths only it can perceive." Lyra's heart pounded at the vague, ominous explanation, glancing toward Kale, and finding his expression equally troubled, though he reached for her hand regardless, his grip steady and reassuring despite the uncertainty ahead. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, meant only for her, "we face it exactly as we have faced everything else. Together." "Together," she echoed, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best effort to remain composed. Maren raised her arms, and the stones surrounding the ceremonial circle began to glow faintly, ancient symbols carved into their surfaces flickering to life with pale silver light that matched the moon overhead. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath Lyra's feet, and she felt the bond pulse suddenly stronger within her chest, as though responding to whatever ancient magic the rite had summoned. Without warning, the ground beneath Kale suddenly gave way, a hidden pit opening directly beneath his feet, and he fell before anyone could react, disappearing into darkness with a sharp cry that tore straight through Lyra's chest. She did not hesitate, did not consider the danger to her own safety, throwing herself forward toward the edge of the pit even as several guards shouted warnings, reaching for anything that might help her reach him. "Kale!" she screamed, peering down into darkness that seemed to stretch impossibly deep, panic clawing at her throat as she searched desperately for any sign of him. "I am here," his voice called back, strained but alive, and relief flooded through her chest, even as she recognized the danger was far from over. "Something moves down here with me. I cannot see it clearly." Lyra did not think, did not weigh the wisdom of her next action against the very real danger it presented. She grabbed the rope one of the guards had hurriedly produced, and, before anyone could stop her, secured it around a nearby stone, and lowered herself directly into the pit after him, ignoring the frantic protests rising from the gathered crowd behind her. The darkness swallowed her almost immediately, the moonlight above shrinking to a distant circle as she descended, her hands raw against the rough rope, her heart hammering with a fear she refused to let slow her movements. She found solid ground sooner than expected, stumbling slightly as her feet touched down, and immediately reached out into the darkness, searching for Cale. "Here," his voice said, closer now, and she felt his hand close around her arm, steady despite the tension radiating through his grip. "You should not have come down here. This danger was meant for me alone." "I told you," she said fiercely, refusing to release his hand, even as her eyes struggled to adjust to the near-total darkness surrounding them. "We face everything together. That includes this." A low growl echoed from somewhere nearby, guttural and unmistakably predatory, and Lyra felt Cale tense beside her, pulling her instinctively behind him despite his own vulnerability in the enclosed space. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice dropping into something sharper, more alert. "What is it?" she whispered, fear coiling tight through her chest. "I do not know," he admitted, "but whatever the rite has summoned, it means to test exactly what Marin described. Sacrifice." The growl sounded again, closer this time, and Lyra caught the faint gleam of eyes reflecting what little light filtered down from above, low to the ground and unmistakably hostile. Whatever creature the ancient magic had conjured to test them, it clearly intended violence, and neither of them had come prepared with proper weapons for such a confrontation. "Get behind me," Cale said firmly, positioning himself between Lyra and the approaching threat despite having nothing beyond his own strength and the natural abilities of his bloodline to defend them both. "I will not simply hide while you face this alone," Lyra protested, though she recognized the futility of arguing, given the immediate danger closing in around them. The creature lunged from the darkness, and everything happened too quickly for conscious thought. Cale moved to intercept it, his body shifting with a speed and ferocity Lyra had not witnessed from him before, meeting the attacking creature head-on even without proper weapons to defend himself. The sound of the impact echoed through the enclosed pit, snarling and struggle audible in the darkness, as Lyra pressed herself against the stone wall, heart racing, desperately searching for anything she might use to help him. Her hand closed around a loose stone, and without fully considering the wisdom of her action, she threw herself toward the sound of struggle, striking out blindly at whatever shape moved against Cale in the darkness. The stone connected with something solid, and the creature's snarl shifted into a pained yelp, giving Cale the opening he needed to finish the confrontation, his own strength finally overwhelming whatever had been summoned to test them. Silence fell heavy and sudden in the pit once the struggle ended, broken only by their ragged breathing as they both fought to steady themselves after the brief, violent encounter. "Are you hurt?" Cale asked immediately, his hands finding her in the darkness, checking for injury with an urgency that spoke clearly to how deeply the danger had shaken him. "I am fine," Lyra assured him, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Are you?" "A few scratches. Nothing serious," he said, though something in his tone suggested he was downplaying the extent of whatever wounds he had sustained protecting her. "You should not have come down here, Lyra. The danger could have cost you your life, and leaving you to face it alone could have cost me something far worse," she said quietly. "I would rather share the danger than survive safely while you faced it without me." Cale was silent for a long moment in the darkness, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an emotion so raw and unguarded that it stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "I love you," he said simply, the words falling into the darkness between them with quiet, undeniable certainty. "Whatever this bond began as, however complicated its origins, I know now, with absolute clarity, that what I feel for you extends far beyond ancient magic or fated obligation. I love you, Lyra, completely and without reservation." Tears sprang unbidden to Lyra's eyes, overwhelming relief and joy crashing through her chest, alongside the lingering fear from their recent danger. "I love you too," she whispered, the truth of it settling deep and certain within her heart. "I think I have for longer than I allowed myself to fully admit." Above them, light suddenly flooded the pit, as ropes and hands reached down to help them climb back toward the surface, the ancient rite apparently satisfied that its final test had been thoroughly and genuinely passed. As they emerged back into the moonlight, hand in hand, bruised and breathless but very much alive, the assembled witnesses fell into stunned silence, and Marin stepped forward, her expression carrying an emotion close to triumph as she addressed the crowd. "The third trial is past," she announced, her voice ringing clear across the ceremonial grounds. "The bond has proven itself true through strength, through trust, and now through sacrifice willingly offered. Let none among us question its legitimacy further." Lyra glanced toward Seraphine amid the assembled witnesses, finding her expression frozen somewhere between shock and fury, her earlier confidence utterly shattered by the undeniable proof now witnessed by every allied representative gathered within the circle. Whatever plans she and her family had built around challenging the bond's legitimacy, they now lay in ruins, exposed as baseless, before the very forces of ancient magic they had hoped would validate their cause instead. But even as relief and joy flooded through Lyra at their successful completion of the trial, she caught sight of something in Seraphine's expression that sent a fresh chill down her spine, a calculating coldness that suggested this defeat, however thorough, would not be the end of her determination to reclaim what she believed had been unfairly stolen from her. The celebration that followed the trial's completion stretched long into the night, the fortress transformed with warm light and music, as delegations from allied territories mingled with fortress residents, all eager to witness firsthand the couple whose bond had proven itself so thoroughly before ancient magic, and gathered witnesses alike. Lyra moved through the festivities on Kale's arm, still slightly overwhelmed by the sudden shift from desperate danger to genuine celebration, though happiness settled warm and steady in her chest despite the lingering exhaustion from everything they had endured. Finn found her partway through the evening, his face bright with excitement as he recounted, in vivid detail, everything he had witnessed from the crowd during the trial, his admiration for both Lyra and Kale evident in every enthusiastic word. "You were so brave," he said, practically bouncing with energy despite the late hour. "Everyone kept saying how remarkable it was, watching you climb down into that pit without any hesitation at all. I could not simply stand by while Kale faced danger alone," Lyra said, smiling as she ruffled her brother's hair affectionately, delighted to see him so full of life and enthusiasm after everything they had endured together. Alara approached shortly after, offering quiet congratulations, along with a careful assessment of any injuries either of them had sustained during the trial, tending to a few scrapes and bruises with practiced efficiency, before allowing them to continue enjoying the celebration, relatively unhindered. Throughout the evening, Lyra noticed representatives from various allied territories approaching Kale with renewed respect, their earlier skepticism about the bond's legitimacy entirely dissolved by the undeniable proof witnessed within the ceremonial circle. Even Seraphine's father approached at one point, his expression carefully neutral, though clearly humbled by the outcome, offering stiff but sincere acknowledgement of the bond's validity before withdrawing to rejoin his own delegation. Seraphine herself remained conspicuously absent for much of the celebration, and Lyra found herself watching the crowd periodically, an uneasy feeling she could not quite shake settling beneath her otherwise genuine joy. She mentioned this to Kale during a quiet moment away from the main festivities, unable to fully release the wariness that had built steadily throughout their weeks of preparation for the trial. "I know that feeling well," Kale admitted, his own expression carrying a similar caution, despite the evening's triumphant outcome. "Seraphine does not accept defeat easily, and I suspect tonight's proceedings, however thoroughly they proved our bond's legitimacy, have not fully extinguished whatever resentment continues driving her actions." "Should we increase security further, given the celebration's size?" Lyra asked, glancing around at the crowded courtyard filled with unfamiliar faces from allied territories. "Dorian has already taken precautions," Kale assured her, though something in his tone suggested he shared her lingering unease despite the reassurance. "But you are right to remain watchful. Tonight's victory does not guarantee tomorrow's safety, particularly given how much Seraphine's family stands to lose from this outcome." Their conversation was interrupted by Ren, who approached with an expression carrying urgent concern beneath her attempt at composed professionalism. "My lord," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only Kale and Lyra could hear clearly. "One of the kitchen staff reported something unusual. Wine meant for the head table found tampered with, the seal broken before it should have been. I thought you should know immediately, given everything that transpired earlier this evening." Kale's expression hardened instantly, all traces of celebratory warmth vanishing beneath sharp, protective focus. "Where is this wine now?" "Secured, untouched," Ren said. The staff member who discovered the tampering immediately flagged it, rather than serving it, exactly as instructed following the earlier concerns raised before the trial. Good, Cale said, relief evident despite his continued tension. Have it tested immediately, and increase scrutiny on all food and drink for the remainder of the evening. I want to know who had access to that particular bottle before it reached the serving table. Wren nodded and hurried off to relay the instructions, leaving Cale and Lyra alone once more amid the ongoing celebration, though the joyful atmosphere now felt considerably more fragile given this fresh evidence of continued danger. They will not stop, will they? Lyra said quietly, fear and frustration mingling in her voice despite her effort to remain composed. Not until they believe every avenue for reclaiming what they lost has been thoroughly exhausted, Cale said grimly. Which means we cannot allow ourselves to grow complacent, regardless of tonight's victory. Within the hour, word arrived from the fortress physician who had tested the tampered wine, confirming Lyra's worst fears. The bottle had indeed been laced with a substance capable of causing severe illness, potentially fatal if consumed in sufficient quantity, particularly by someone already weakened from the physical demands of the trial they had just completed. Cale's fury at the confirmation was evident despite his careful control, and he immediately called Dorian to investigate further, determined to trace the tampering back to whoever had orchestrated it within the fortress walls. The investigation moved quickly, guards questioning kitchen staff and tracking the bottle's journey from storage to serving table, until finally, late into the night, they identified a temporary staff member who had been hired specifically to assist with the celebration preparations, someone whose credentials, upon closer examination, proved entirely fabricated. She has fled the fortress grounds already, Dorian reported grimly, once the investigation had run its course. Guards are searching the surrounding territory, though I suspect she anticipated discovery and prepared an escape route in advance. Do we know for certain she acted under Seraphine's direction? Cale asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. We cannot prove it definitively, not yet, Dorian admitted. But the timing, combined with everything else we have uncovered these past weeks, makes the connection difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Lyra listened to the exchange with growing unease, understanding that even with the trial successfully completed, the danger surrounding their bond had not fully receded. Seraphine's desperation, whether driven by genuine heartbreak over a lost alliance or simply wounded pride at such a public defeat, showed no sign of relenting, and Lyra found herself wondering, with mounting dread, just how far that desperation might eventually drive her. We need to consider more permanent security measures, Cale said finally, addressing Dorian with grim determination. I will not allow this campaign of sabotage to continue indefinitely. If Seraphine's family refuses to accept the trial's outcome, we may need to pursue a more direct confrontation to end this threat once and for all. That risks further escalation, my lord, Dorian cautioned. Confronting them directly, without irrefutable proof of their involvement, could damage relations with other allied territories who might view such action as unjustified aggression. I understand the risk, Cale said, but I understand equally well the risk of allowing this to continue unchecked, particularly given how close tonight's tampering came to causing genuine harm. The celebration wound down not long after, the earlier joy tempered considerably by the fresh revelation of continued danger, and Lyra retired to her chamber that night, with Cale's protective presence lingering close beside her, both of them acutely aware that whatever peace their trial victory had promised remained fragile and incomplete, while Seraphine's desperate schemes continued unresolved. As she finally drifted toward uneasy sleep, Lyra found herself replaying Cale's words from within the darkness of the pit, the raw honesty of his declared love settling warm and certain despite the lingering fear surrounding their situation. Whatever dangers still awaited them, whatever further schemes Seraphine's wounded pride might yet devise, Lyra understood with unwavering clarity that she would face every one of them beside the man who had claimed her heart as thoroughly and completely as the ancient bond had claimed their fates together. The following morning brought little relief from the tension of the previous night. Cale called an early council meeting, gathering his most trusted advisors along with Dorian and Marin to discuss how best to address the continued threat posed by Seraphine's family. Lyra attended at his request, her presence now welcomed rather than merely tolerated among the council members who had witnessed her courage during the trial firsthand. We cannot continue reacting to each new attempt without addressing the source directly, one advisor argued, an older warrior named Garrick whose weathered face carried the marks of decades spent defending the fortress. Every failed attempt only seems to deepen their desperation rather than discourage it. I agree, Kale said, which is why I intend to send a formal message to Seraphine's father, making clear that any further attempts against Lyra's safety will be treated as a direct act of aggression against this territory, with all the consequences such aggression typically carries. That risks open conflict between our territories, another advisor cautioned. Perhaps, Kale acknowledged, but allowing this campaign of sabotage to continue unchecked risks something far more precious. I will not gamble with Lyra's safety simply to avoid uncomfortable political tension. Marin spoke up then, her quiet voice carrying weight despite its age-worn rasp. There may be another approach worth considering, one that addresses the underlying wound driving Seraphine's actions, rather than simply threatening consequence for continued aggression. What do you propose? Kale asked. Speak with her directly, Marin said. Not through formal channels or council intermediaries, but honestly, acknowledging the genuine loss she has experienced, however necessary that loss proved for fate's true design to unfold. Sometimes wounded pride softens more readily when met with honest acknowledgement rather than pure confrontation. Kale considered this suggestion carefully, glancing toward Lyra as though seeking her thoughts on the matter. Lyra nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in Marin's suggestion, even as uncertainty about its safety lingered in her mind. It could work, she said, though I would want assurances for your safety, given everything that has already happened. I will take Dorian and a full guard escort, Kale assured her. This is not recklessness, merely an attempt to resolve this conflict through understanding, rather than continued escalation. The council ultimately agreed to Marin's proposed approach, and within 2 days, arrangements had been made for Kale to meet privately with Seraphine at a neutral location along the border between their territories, accompanied by sufficient guard presence to ensure his safety without appearing as though he approached the meeting from a position of aggression. Lyra remained behind at the fortress during this meeting, though the waiting proved almost unbearable, her thoughts constantly drifting toward worry about what might unfold during the delicate conversation, despite Kale's repeated reassurances before his departure that morning. She spent the anxious hours with Finn, whose continued recovery had progressed to the point where Alara declared him fully cured of the wasting sickness that had once threatened his life so severely. The news brought genuine joy amid her lingering worry, and she allowed herself a small measure of peace watching her brother run freely through the fortress gardens, with several friends he had made among the younger fortress residents, his laughter bright and unburdened by the illness that had shadowed so much of his young life. It was late afternoon, when word finally arrived that Kale's party had returned safely, and Lyra hurried toward the main courtyard, relief flooding through her at the sight of him dismounting from his horse, expression thoughtful, but not troubled in the way she had feared. How did it go? She asked immediately, searching his face for any sign of the outcome. Better than I expected, Kale admitted, guiding her toward a quieter corner of the courtyard, away from the bustling activity of returning guards. Seraphine was angry at first, understandably so, given everything she has lost through this situation. But when I acknowledged honestly the genuine care I once held for her, the respect I still carry for our family's history together, something in her demeanor shifted. Did she agree to end the attempts against me? Lyra asked cautiously, unwilling to allow relief to settle fully until she understood the full outcome of the conversation. She did, Kale said, though I believe the true turning point came when I explained, as honestly as I could, what the bond has come to mean to me. Not merely ancient magic fulfilling destined obligation, but genuine love, chosen and cherished, regardless of how it began. I think, in the end, she recognized something in my words that resonated beyond simple political calculation. Whatever pain she carries from this outcome, I believe she understood, finally, that continuing to fight against fate itself would only bring further suffering to everyone involved. Lyra absorbed his words with cautious hope, though she recognized the wisdom in remaining watchful despite this apparent resolution. Do you believe she will honor this agreement? I believe so, Kale said, though I have made clear that any further attempts against your safety will be treated with the full severity such aggression deserves. I do not think she will risk pushing further, not after witnessing so clearly how thoroughly the trial proved our bond's legitimacy. Relief settled slowly through Lyra's chest, as the reality of this resolution sank in, though she understood, even as hope grew steadier within her, that true peace would only be confirmed through time and continued vigilance, rather than a single conversation, however honest and heartfelt it may have been. The weeks that followed brought a gradual settling of the tension that had gripped the fortress for so long. No further attempts against Lyra's safety materialized, and reports from Allied territories suggested Seraphine had withdrawn from public affairs for a time, whether from genuine acceptance or simply the need for space to process her losses. No one could say with certainty. Whatever the reason, the fortress slowly returned to a rhythm of ordinary life, one that allowed Lyra and Kale the rare luxury of simply enjoying the bond they had fought so hard to protect. Finn thrived in this new peace, his health fully restored, his days filled with training alongside other young fortress residents and lessons from Alara, who had taken a particular interest in teaching him the foundations of healing knowledge that clearly ran in his blood alongside his sisters. Lyra watched him grow more confident and joyful with each passing week, grateful beyond words for the life he now had the chance to build within these once unfamiliar walls. Her own days settled into a comfortable pattern as well, though far from idle. She began assisting Alara regularly in the fortress healing chambers, her skills proving valuable beyond simple emergency care, and gradually, she found herself building a reputation among fortress residents as a healer whose gentle competence rivaled even Alara's considerable experience. The work brought her genuine satisfaction, a sense of purpose that extended beyond her role as Kale's bonded partner, and she found deep fulfillment in continuing the calling her mother had first instilled in her so many years earlier. Kale, for his part, seemed lighter than she had ever witnessed him during those early, tension-filled weeks of their bond's formation. The careful, guarded composure he had once worn like armor gradually softened into something warmer, more genuinely present, particularly during the quiet moments they shared together, away from the demands of ruling his territory. Council members and fortress staff alike commented on the change, though always with quiet approval rather than concern, understanding intuitively that whatever had shifted within their king reflected positively on his continued capacity to lead with both strength and compassion. One evening, several weeks after the resolution of the conflict with Seraphine's family, Kale found Lyra in the Eastern Garden, where they had spent so many quiet moments together throughout their relationship's careful development. He carried something small wrapped in cloth, and something in his expression, nervous in a way she had rarely witnessed from him, immediately caught her attention. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting aside the book she had been reading as he approached. "Nothing is wrong," he assured her, though his hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady as he settled onto the bench beside her. "I have been considering something for some time now, and I believe tonight feels like the right moment to finally voice it." Lyra's heart quickened with curious anticipation as he unwrapped the small bundle he carried, revealing a delicate ring crafted from silver, its design incorporating subtle wolf motifs that echoed the fortress's ancient crest, though rendered with a gentleness that made the piece feel personal rather than merely ceremonial. "The bond fate revealed between us has already proven itself beyond any doubt, both to ancient magic and to everyone who witnessed our trial," Kale said, his voice carrying a warmth and sincerity that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. "But I find myself wanting something more than what fate alone provided. I want to choose you as well, deliberately and completely, in a way that reflects my own heart rather than simply the magic that first connected us." He held out the ring, his gaze steady despite the vulnerability evident in every line of his expression. "Lyra Voss, will you marry me? Not because ancient magic decreed it, though I am endlessly grateful for the path that led us here, but because I love you completely, and I cannot imagine building the remainder of my life with anyone other than you standing beside me." Tears sprang immediately to Lyra's eyes, overwhelming joy flooding through her chest as she absorbed the full weight of his sincere, heartfelt proposal. "Yes," she said without hesitation, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, absolutely yes." Kale's expression broke into a genuine smile, rare and radiant, as he slipped the ring gently onto her finger, and Lyra found herself laughing through her tears, overwhelmed by happiness she had never dared to imagine finding when she first set out on her desperate journey toward this fortress so many weeks earlier. News of their engagement spread quickly throughout the fortress, greeted with genuine celebration from residents who had come to admire both Lyra's courage and the positive transformation they had witnessed in their king throughout the months since her arrival. Ren organized an impromptu gathering that evening, and Finn's excitement upon hearing the news practically vibrated through the entire fortress, his enthusiasm infectious enough to draw smiles from even the most reserved council members. Wedding preparations began shortly after, though Kale insisted on keeping the ceremony relatively modest, understanding that Lyra, despite her new position, remained most comfortable with simplicity and genuine connection rather than elaborate spectacle. Marin offered to oversee the ceremonial aspects, ensuring the wedding honored both traditional fortress customs and the unique nature of their fated bond, while Alara and Ren took charge of more practical arrangements, determined to ensure the day proceeded smoothly, despite the relatively short timeline Kale had requested. Word arrived unexpectedly, roughly 2 weeks before the planned ceremony, that Seraphine had requested permission to attend, along with a formal letter addressed directly to Lyra, an unusual gesture that immediately sparked cautious curiosity throughout the Fortress Council. "Should we be concerned?" Dorian asked when the request first arrived, his protective instincts clearly still wary despite the months of peace since their earlier conflict. Lyra considered the question carefully before responding. "I do not believe so," she said finally. Perhaps this is simply her way of finding genuine closure, rather than continuing to carry resentment toward something she has finally accepted as unchangeable. Kale left the decision ultimately to Lyra, respecting her judgment on the matter, and after some consideration, she agreed to both requests, curious what the letter might contain, and willing to extend the same grace Kale had offered during their earlier private conversation. The letter, when Lyra finally read it alone in her chamber, revealed a side of Seraphine she had not previously glimpsed, honest and vulnerable in ways her earlier cold confrontations had never suggested. Seraphine wrote of her genuine grief at losing what she had long believed would be her future, acknowledged the desperation that had driven her toward increasingly dangerous actions, and offered, with evident difficulty, sincere apology for the harm those actions had nearly caused. "I recognize now what I could not accept before," the letter concluded, "that fate rarely concerns itself with the plans we build around it, however carefully constructed. I wish you both genuine happiness, and I hope, in time, we might find our way toward peace between our territories, built on something more solid than mere political convenience." Lyra folded the letter carefully, moved by its honesty despite everything that had transpired between them, and resolved to extend a genuine welcome when Seraphine arrived for the ceremony, understanding that true healing, for all parties involved, required exactly the kind of grace this moment now offered. The wedding day arrived beneath clear skies, the fortress transformed with simple but elegant decorations that reflected both territories' traditions, silver ribbons and early blooming flowers, arranged throughout the same ceremonial grounds, where their bond had once faced its most dangerous trial. Lyra stood at the entrance of the circle, dressed in flowing white robes, accented with the same silver thread that had marked the sacred blade's hilt, Finn beside her, beaming with pride as he prepared to walk her toward the waiting ceremony. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice carrying a maturity that spoke to how much he had grown throughout their months at the fortress. "Mother would be proud, seeing how far you have come." Lyra's eyes filled with tears at the mention of their mother, though they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, gratitude swelling in her chest for every difficult step that had led her toward this remarkable moment. As they walked together through the assembled crowd, Lyra caught sight of familiar faces gathered to witness the ceremony, Dorian standing proud among the guard formation, Alara and Ren seated together near the front, Marin positioned at the circle's center, ready to preside over the sacred vows. She also spotted Seraphine among the gathered witnesses, her expression carrying genuine warmth, rather than the cold hostility that had once defined their every interaction, and Lyra offered her a small, sincere smile of gratitude for her presence. Kale waited at the center of the circle, dressed in formal attire that echoed the silver and deep blue colors of his territory, his expression radiant with a joy that transformed his usually composed features into something entirely unguarded. As Lyra approached, his gaze never wavered from hers, and she felt the bond pulse warm and steady between them, a constant reminder of everything they had overcome together to reach this moment. Marin began the ceremony with words that honored both the ancient magic that had first drawn them together, and the genuine love they had chosen to build upon that foundation. And as Lyra and Kale exchanged vows beneath the clear afternoon sky, surrounded by everyone who had supported them through months of danger and uncertainty. She felt a profound sense of completion settle deep within her heart. When Kale finally sealed their vows with a gentle kiss, the assembled crowd erupted into joyful celebration, and Lyra found herself laughing through happy tears, overwhelmed by gratitude for every difficult step that had led her, ultimately, toward this remarkable life she had never dared to imagine when she first set out on her desperate journey to steal a sacred blade from a fortress she had every reason to fear. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the fortress grounds as representatives from allied territories mingled freely with fortress residents, all genuinely delighted to witness the joyful conclusion of a bond that had faced such significant challenges throughout its formation. Lyra moved through the festivities with Kale's hand firmly clasped in hers, greeting well-wishers and accepting congratulations, with a warmth that felt entirely natural, despite how far she had traveled from her humble beginnings in Thornfield. Seraphine approached late in the evening, finding a quiet moment when Lyra had briefly stepped away from the main celebration, to catch her breath near the same garden where Kale had proposed weeks earlier. Lyra tensed slightly at her approach, old caution not entirely faded despite the sincere letter she had received, but Seraphine's expression carried none of the coldness from their earlier encounters. "I wanted to offer my congratulations in person," Seraphine said, her voice quiet and genuine, "and to thank you for allowing me the chance to attend, given everything that transpired between us." "I am glad you came," Lyra said honestly. "Your letter meant a great deal to me. I understand this outcome was not what you once hoped for, and I am grateful for the grace you have shown in accepting it." Seraphine offered a small, somewhat rueful smile. It took time, and considerable reflection, to reach genuine acceptance rather than simple resignation. But watching the two of you today, seeing the joy so evident between you, I find myself truly happy for what you have built, even if it required the loss of something I once believed essential to my own future. "Perhaps fate has something equally remarkable planned for you as well," Lyra offered gently, "though I understand if such reassurance feels hollow given everything you have endured these past months." "It does not feel hollow," Seraphine said, surprising her. "If anything, watching your bond prove itself so thoroughly has given me renewed faith that fate, however disruptive to careful planning, ultimately guides us toward where we are truly meant to be. Perhaps my own path simply requires patience I have not yet fully learned to embrace." They parted on genuinely warm terms, and Lyra returned to the celebration feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not fully realized she still carried, grateful for the unexpected reconciliation that had brought welcome closure to a conflict that had once threatened everything she and Kale had built together. As the celebration continued into the night, Kale found her again near the edge of the festivities, his expression soft with contentment as he pulled her close, the warmth of the bond pulsing steady and comfortable between them, a constant reminder of everything they had overcome to reach this joyful moment. "Happy?" he asked quietly, studying her expression with the same careful attention he always offered her. "Impossibly so," she answered honestly, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the celebration continue around them, stars beginning to emerge overhead as the moon rose slowly above the fortress walls that had once seemed so foreign and frightening to her, and now felt entirely, completely, like home. Their first months as bonded partners settled into a life richer than either had anticipated during those uncertain early weeks. Kale continued his duties as Alpha King with renewed energy, his rule tempered by the compassion Lyra had helped him rediscover, and allied territories increasingly praised the fortress for both its strength and its evident fairness under his continued leadership. Lyra's role within the healing chambers grew steadily as well, and she began training several younger fortress residents in techniques passed down from her own mother, ensuring that knowledge continued spreading through a new generation eager to learn. Finn flourished in this settled life, his earlier illness now nothing more than a difficult memory, his days filled with training, lessons, and the easy camaraderie of friends he had made throughout his time at the fortress. He often accompanied Lyra during her healing work, showing genuine aptitude that suggested he might one day follow in both his mother's and sister's footsteps, a possibility that filled Lyra with quiet pride whenever she considered it. The sacred blade that had first brought them together remained displayed prominently within the fortress, though now honored rather than simply stored, a symbol of the bond that had proven itself capable of surviving trial. sabotage, and every obstacle placed deliberately in its path. Visitors to the fortress often requested to see it, drawn by the story of its unusual bonding that had spread throughout Allied territories, and Kale and Lyra found themselves, more than once, retelling the tale of that fateful night when a desperate healer's daughter had reached for a relic she never imagined would reshape the entire course of her life. As the first anniversary of their bonding approached, Lyra found herself reflecting on everything the past year had brought. The terror of that initial theft, the confusion and wariness of those early days within unfamiliar walls, the growing warmth that had gradually blossomed into genuine love, despite every obstacle determined to prevent it. She thought of Seraphine's eventual grace, of Finn's remarkable recovery, of the steady, unwavering strength Kale had shown throughout every challenge they faced together, and gratitude swelled so completely within her chest that she found herself smiling, unbidden, at the sheer improbability of the life she now called her own. 2 years passed, and the fortress that had once felt so foreign to Lyra had long since become simply home, its stone corridors and quiet gardens as familiar to her now as the small cottage in Thornfield where she had spent her childhood learning healing craft at her mother's knee. Much had changed in that time, though the foundation of what mattered most, the bond that had first brought her and Kale together through such unlikely circumstances, remained steady and strong, deepened rather than diminished by the ordinary rhythms of a shared life. Lyra stood now in the same healing chambers where she had first begun assisting Ilara, though her role had grown considerably since those early days. She oversaw a small but dedicated group of apprentices, young healers drawn from across Allied territories eager to learn techniques that combined traditional herbal knowledge with the careful, intuitive understanding of the body that she had first developed tending injured travelers along dangerous border roads. Her reputation had spread well beyond the fortress walls, and messengers occasionally arrived from distant villages, seeking her guidance for particularly difficult cases, a level of respect she had never imagined achieving when she first set out on her desperate journey years earlier. Finn, now taller and considerably more confident than the frail, sickly boy who had once arrived at the fortress gates barely able to stand unassisted, had begun formal training under Ilara's guidance, his natural aptitude for healing craft evident in every lesson he undertook with genuine enthusiasm. He often joked that he intended to surpass his sister's reputation one day, a claim Lyra found endlessly amusing given how far he still had to travel before matching her considerable experience, though she never doubted his potential to eventually make good on that ambitious promise. Kale's rule had strengthened considerably throughout these past years, Allied territories increasingly viewing the fortress as a model of both strength and genuine fairness, qualities that had drawn even more distant pacts toward seeking closer ties with his leadership. The earlier tension with Seraphine's territory had long since resolved into genuine friendship between their peoples, and Seraphine herself, Lyra had learned through occasional correspondence, had recently begun a courtship of her own with a leader from a neighboring pack, one that appeared, from the warmth evident in her letters, to bring her genuine happiness rather than mere political convenience. On a quiet morning, much like countless others throughout their years together, Lyra woke to find Kale already awake beside her, watching her with the same soft, contented expression that still made her heart flutter despite the familiarity of years spent together. "You are staring," she murmured, still half asleep, though a smile tugged at her lips regardless. "I find myself doing that rather often," he admitted, brushing a strand of hair gently from her face. "I do not believe I will ever grow accustomed to how fortunate I am, waking each morning beside you." Lyra laughed softly, reaching up to trace her fingers along his jaw, marveling still, after all this time, at how completely her life had transformed from that desperate night when fear and determination had driven her toward a fortress she believed held nothing but danger. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "When everything began?" "Often," Kale admitted, "though I find myself grateful for it now, rather than resentful of how thoroughly it disrupted the careful plans I once believed my life required. I cannot imagine the person I might have become had you never reached for that blade. Nor can I imagine who I would be had Finn never fallen ill, forcing me toward a desperation brave enough to attempt something so reckless," Lyra said. Perhaps Marin was right, all those months ago, when she insisted the blade never makes mistakes. "I have learned not to doubt her wisdom," Kale said, smiling as he pulled Lyra closer. the familiar warmth of the bond pulsing gently between them, steady and comfortable after years of deliberate nurturing, beyond whatever ancient magic had first sparked its formation. Later that morning, they walked together through the fortress gardens, now in full bloom, beneath the warm early summer sun, greeting residents and guards alike, who had grown accustomed to seeing their king and queen wander freely among the grounds they governed together, with genuine partnership rather than distant authority. Finn joined them partway through their walk, animatedly describing a particularly challenging case he had assisted Alara with the previous evening, his enthusiasm for healing craft evident in every detailed explanation he offered. As they reached the training yard, where Kale had first taught Finn simple defensive movements so many years earlier, Lyra paused, watching younger fortress residents practice under careful instruction, memories of that pivotal afternoon washing warmly through her thoughts. So much had changed since that day, and yet the fundamental truth at the heart of everything, the genuine connection between herself and Kale that had grown from fated obligation into deliberate, treasured love, remained exactly as steady and true as it had been from those very first uncertain days. That evening, as the fortress settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, Lyra found herself once more in the eastern garden that had witnessed so many pivotal moments throughout their relationship, the same bench where Kale had first proposed, still standing beneath the same canopy of night-blooming flowers that had perfumed the air during that unforgettable evening. Kale joined her there as the stars began emerging overhead, settling close beside her with the easy familiarity of years spent building a life together. "I have news," Lyra said quietly, unable to fully contain the smile tugging at her lips, despite her attempt at composed delivery. Kale turned toward her immediately, curiosity and gentle concern evident in his expression. "What news?" "Alara confirmed it just this afternoon," Lyra said, taking his hand and pressing it gently against her stomach, watching understanding dawn slowly across his features as the meaning of her words settled fully into place. "We are going to have a child." Kale's expression transformed entirely, joy and wonder breaking across his features so completely that Lyra felt tears prick unexpectedly at her own eyes, moved by the depth of emotion so openly displayed by a man who had once guarded his feelings so carefully behind careful, controlled composure. "A child," he repeated softly, his voice thick with emotion as his hand remained gently pressed against her stomach, as though he could somehow already sense the new life growing there. "I do not have words sufficient to express how happy this makes me." "You do not need words," she said softly, watching the pure joy radiating from every line of his expression. "Your face says more than enough." They sat together beneath the darkening sky, hands clasped, hearts full with anticipation for the new chapter about to unfold in their already remarkable journey together, and Lyra found herself reflecting once more on everything that had led her toward this precious moment. The desperate theft that had begun everything, the fear and uncertainty of those early days, the trials that had tested their bond so thoroughly, the sabotage and danger they had overcome together, and finally, the deep, genuine love that had blossomed from what began as nothing more than ancient magic's unexpected intervention. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the years ahead, whatever new responsibilities parenthood would bring alongside the continued duties of ruling their territory together, Lyra understood with complete certainty that she and Kale would face every one of them exactly as they had faced everything since that fateful night, together, bound not merely by ancient magic, but by a love chosen deliberately and treasured completely, strong enough to weather whatever storms the future might yet bring. As the last light faded from the sky above the fortress that had become her true home, Lyra rested her head against Kale's shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, grateful beyond measure for the desperate, reckless choice that had once sent her reaching for a sacred blade she never imagined would awaken something so profound, so lasting, and so completely worth every danger she had faced to find it. The fortress settled quietly around them, its ancient walls holding within them countless stories of trial and triumph, of love found in the most unexpected circumstances, and somewhere within its depths, the sacred blade that had begun it all rested peacefully in its place of honor, its purpose fulfilled, its magic proven true, a silent witness to a bond that had transformed from stolen accident into the truest, most treasured gift either of them had ever received.